Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Marcus Helton, and I am 34 years old. This happened in August 2024. I've always been drawn to places that most people avoid. The wilder, the better. The more remote, the more appealing. It's not that I'm antisocial. I just find peace in the absence of human noise. After my divorce finalized last spring, that need for isolation grew stronger. My therapist called it avoidance behavior, but I called it self-preservation. That's why I decided to take a solo kayaking trip through the Honey Island Swamp in Louisiana. The place has a reputation: ghost stories, monster sightings, and tales of people who ventured in but never came out. Perfect for someone like me who wanted to disappear for a while, if not forever. I'd researched the area thoroughly. 21,000 acres of protected swampland, one of the most pristine river swamps in the country. Most tourists stick to the guided tours near Pearl River, but I had mapped a route that would take me deep into the less traversed eastern reaches, where cypress trees older than America itself stand sentinel over the murky waters, where legends say the Honey Island Swamp Monster, a 7-foot bipedal creature covered in matted gray hair, makes its home. I told myself I didn't believe in monsters, but part of me hoped to find something out there that would make me feel something again, even if that something was fear. The humidity hit me like a physical force as I stepped out of my truck at the Crawford Landing boat launch. August in Louisiana is brutal. The air so thick you can practically drink it. Sweat immediately beaded on my skin, and mosquitoes welcomed me with eager buzzing. It was barely 7 a.m. and already the temperature was pushing 85 degrees. I unloaded my kayak, a sleek, forest green wilderness touring model I'd spent too much money on after signing the divorce papers. Sarah had gotten the house. I'd gotten freedom and enough settlement money to buy unnecessary outdoor gear. A fair trade, in my mind. A local man in faded overalls was preparing his flat-bottomed boat nearby. He glanced at my equipment with obvious skepticism. "Heading out solo?" he asked, lighting a cigarette. "That's the plan," I replied, securing my dry bags. "Going to spend a few days exploring the eastern channels." He took a long drag, eyes narrowing. "Eastern side, huh? Past the Frierson Preserve?" I nodded, continuing my preparations. "Wouldn't go that way if I was you," he said matter-of-factly, "especially not alone." I'd heard these warnings before from locals who either wanted to scare tourists or genuinely believed the legends. Either way, I wasn't deterred. "I'll be fine," I assured him. "Got my GPS, emergency beacon, plenty of supplies." He shook his head. "Ain't about supplies, mister. Some things out there don't care how prepared you are." He gestured vaguely toward the swamp. "They've been finding bodies lately. Just parts, mostly. Game wardens say it's gators, but what?" I prompted when he trailed off. "Gators don't stack bones," he said quietly, then turned back to his boat. A chill ran through me despite the heat. I told myself it was just another local legend, designed to keep strangers away from prime fishing spots. Still, as I pushed my kayak into the dark water, his words lingered in my mind. The first day on the water was exactly what I needed. The main channels near Pearl River were busy with tour boats and other kayakers, but as I paddled eastward, the human presence thinned. By afternoon, I was completely alone, navigating through narrow waterways where cypress knees jutted from the water like the fingers of drowning giants. The swamp has its own soundtrack, a primal opera of croaking frogs, buzzing insects, and the occasional splash of something entering or exiting the water. Birds called to each other from the canopy above, the haunting cry of a yellow-crowned night heron, the sharp chirp of prothnotary warblers. I set up my first camp on a raised area of relatively dry ground. a small island with enough space for my one-person tent and a small fire ring. As darkness fell, the swamp transformed. The water turned from brown to black, reflecting the stars when they managed to peek through the canopy. My fire cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, making them seem alive and watchful. That night, I slept surprisingly well, lulled by the symphony of the swamp. I dreamed of Sarah, which was unusual. In the dream, she was trying to tell me something important, her face contorted with urgency, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of rushing water. I woke before dawn to the sound of something large moving through the water near my campsite. Probably an alligator, I thought, though it sounded bigger than any gator I'd encountered before. I remained still in my tent, waiting for it to pass. The splashing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I could have sworn I heard breathing. Heavy, wet breaths, like someone with fluid in their lungs. When I finally emerged from my tent at first light, I found large, unusual tracks in the mud at the edge of my island. They were partially filled with water, making it impossible to determine what had made them. But they were bigger than my hand and showed what looked like claw marks at the tips. I told myself it was a black bear. They're rare in the swamp, but not unheard of. Still, something about those tracks made me uneasy. They seemed to circle my campsite, as if whatever made them had been checking me out while I slept. By midday of my second day, I had reached what I believed was the eastern boundary of the Frierson Preserve. The map showed a network of increasingly narrow channels through this area, eventually opening into a series of small lakes that few tourists ever visited. The swamp grew denser here, the trees forming a cathedral-like canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The water darkened to the color of strong tea, tannins from decomposing vegetation staining it almost black in places. The air grew heavier, filled with the sweet-rot smell of decay and new life built upon it. As I navigated a particularly narrow passage, my kayak suddenly scraped against something beneath the surface. I leaned over to see what I'd hit, expecting a submerged log or cypress knee. Instead, I found myself staring at what appeared to be a crude structure built from branches and bones. Dozens of animal skulls and femurs lashed together with vines and partially submerged in the murky water. My heart rate spiked. This was no natural formation. Someone or something had built this. I pushed away quickly, a sense of being watched washing over me. The local man's words echoed in my mind. Gators don't stack bones. I scanned the shoreline but saw nothing unusual among the curtains of Spanish moss and tangled vegetation. Still, the feeling of eyes on me remained. I paddled faster, eager to reach more open water. The channel widened eventually, opening into a small kidney-shaped lake I identified on my map as Gum Slough. I planned to make camp on its western shore, where the map showed another small island of dry ground. As I crossed the open water, something large moved beneath my kayak, creating a wake that rocked me slightly. Too big for a garfish, too smooth in its movement for an alligator. I wondered if it might be a bull shark. They've been known to venture into freshwater systems in Louisiana. Whatever it was, it didn't surface, and I reached my planned campsite without further incident. This island was larger than my previous one, with a clearing in the center surrounded by old-growth cypress trees. Signs of human presence were evident. A fire pit ringed with stones, weathered beer cans half buried in the soil, and, most disturbingly, a crude symbol carved into the largest cypress tree. A circle with a vertical line through it, surrounded by smaller marks that might have been letters in some language I didn't recognize. I should have moved on, found another spot to camp, but daylight was fading fast and navigating the swamp in darkness wasn't an option. So I set up my tent and gathered wood for a fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. As the sun dipped below the trees, I heard something unusual. Music, faint but unmistakable, drifting across the water. A fiddle, playing a melancholy tune I didn't recognize. It seemed to be coming from the eastern shore of the lake, where my map showed only uninterrupted swampland for miles. I strained my eyes but could see no lights, no sign of habitation in that direction. The music continued for perhaps 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly mid-phrase. The sudden silence felt more unsettling than the music itself. I built my fire larger than necessary that night, needing the light as much as the warmth. As darkness enveloped the swamp, I began to notice how the sounds around me had changed. The normal chorus of frogs and insects had diminished, replaced by occasional splashes and creaks that seemed to come from all directions. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my tent, listening to the night sounds and trying to convince myself that everything I'd experienced had natural explanations. The bone structure was probably made by locals to scare tourists. The music was likely from a fishing camp I couldn't see from my vantage point. The symbol on the tree was just graffiti left by previous campers. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I jerked awake sometime later to total silence. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to make out shapes. The silence was absolute. No insects, no frogs, no nightbirds. Nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my camp. Heavy footsteps that squelched in the mud, moving with purpose. I lay frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The steps completed a circle around my tent, then stopped directly in front of the entrance. I heard breathing again. That same wet, labored breathing I'd heard the night before, but closer now. Much closer. Something sniffed at the tent fabric, sending vibrations through the nylon. My hand crept toward my backpack where I kept a hunting knife, my fingers closing around the handle just as a shadow fell across the tent. Something large, blocking what little light remained from the dying fire. The shadow remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, it retreated. The footsteps moved away, back toward the water, followed by a splash. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning revealed more tracks, these clearer than before. They looked almost human but were too large, with odd proportions and what appeared to be only 3 toes ending in pointed tips. They led from the water's edge to my tent and back again. I broke camp quickly, eager to be on the move. Part of me wanted to turn back, to return to the safety of the more trafficked areas of the swamp, but a larger part, the part that had driven me out here in the first place, pushed me to continue eastward. If there was something out here, something unknown, I wanted to see it, needed to see it. The third day brought me deeper into the maze of channels and isolated pools that makes up the eastern reaches of Honey Island. My GPS signal became intermittent, forcing me to rely more on my paper map and compass. The vegetation grew more primeval, the cypress trees larger and more ancient-looking. In some places, the canopy was so thick that it felt like twilight even at midday. Around noon, I came upon something that stopped me cold. A small wooden structure built on stilts above the water, a typical swamp fishing cabin, but clearly abandoned for many years. Its walls were weathered gray, windows broken, the small porch sagging dangerously. Under normal circumstances, I would have passed it by, but something caught my eye, a splash of color on the weathered wood. As I paddled closer, I saw it was a symbol painted in what looked like red clay, the same circle with a vertical line that I'd seen carved into the tree at my previous campsite. Curiosity overcame caution. I secured my kayak to one of the stilts and carefully climbed onto the rickety porch. The door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing a single-room interior. The inside was largely empty, a rusted metal bed frame, a small table, the remains of a wood stove. But the walls told a different story. They were covered with the same symbol, painted in various sizes, interspersed with what appeared to be crude maps of the swamp. And photographs, dozens of old Polaroids tacked to the wall, yellowed with age. I moved closer to examine them, and my blood turned to ice. The photos showed people, tourists from the look of their clothing, but their faces had been scratched out in every image. Below the photos, arranged on a crude shelf, were personal items: watches, rings, eyeglasses, wallets, trophies. I backed away, suddenly understanding what I'd stumbled upon. This wasn't some swamp monster's lair. This was the hideout of something far more dangerous, a human predator who used the legends of the swamp to cover their activities. As I turned to leave, my foot knocked against something under the bed frame. I crouched down to see what it was and found a metal box, like an old ammunition container. Against my better judgment, I pulled it out and opened it. Inside was a journal, the pages warped from humidity but still legible. I flipped it open to a random page and read, August the 18th, 2017. 2 more today. City folk, easy to follow. They never look behind them, only ahead. Never hear me coming. The swamp helps me, hides me, feeds me, preserves the parts I need for the offering. I slammed the book shut, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of there, to get back to civilization and alert the authorities. I shoved the journal into my dry bag, evidence they would need. As I hurried back to my kayak, I heard it. The fiddle music again, closer this time, coming from somewhere to the east. And with it, voices. Chanting, rhythmic, and guttural. I practically leaped into my kayak and started paddling west, back the way I had come. The music followed me, seemingly from all directions now. The fiddle joined by what sounded like drums and more voices. I paddled harder than I ever had before, my muscles screaming in protest. The channels all looked the same, and with my GPS still malfunctioning, I wasn't entirely sure I was headed in the right direction. The swamp seemed to be shifting around me, channels that should have been there according to my map now blocked by fallen trees or simply not existing at all. After an hour of frantic paddling, I realized I was lost. The sun, when I could catch glimpses of it through the canopy, told me I was heading roughly northwest, not directly back toward the boat launch, but away from the music and voices, which was all that mattered to me at that moment. As evening approached, I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the swamp. The channels had narrowed to the point that branches scraped both sides of my kayak simultaneously. The water had become shallow and stagnant, with a foul odor rising from it. I'd have to find a place to camp soon, before darkness made navigation impossible. Just as I was beginning to despair, the channel widened, revealing a large, circular pond I didn't recognize from my map. In the center of the pond was an island, larger than the others I'd camped on, with what appeared to be the ruins of a structure of some kind at its highest point. With no better options, I paddled toward it. As I approached, I could make out what the structure was, the remains of an old stone tower, probably dating back to the 19th century. Some kind of navigation marker, perhaps from when these swamps were more actively used for transportation. The island itself was unusual, higher than the surrounding terrain, with actual dry land rather than the sodden soil I'd encountered at my previous campsites. Ancient oak trees grew alongside the cypresses, creating an unusual mixed forest. Under different circumstances, I might have found it beautiful. I pulled my kayak onto a small beach of dark sand and secured it to a tree root. The tower stood about 50 yards inland, partially collapsed but still rising maybe 20 feet above the ground. It was built from dark stone that wasn't native to the area, each block massive and precisely cut. As I approached it, I noticed more symbols carved into the stones, the now familiar circle and line, but also more complex designs. Spirals, interlocking triangles, and what appeared to be stylized human figures with elongated limbs. The interior of the tower was hollow, open to the sky above where part of the structure had collapsed. The ground inside was bare earth, but arranged in a pattern that was clearly intentional. A spiral pathway leading to the center, where a stone altar stood. I should have left immediately. Everything about this place screamed danger, but exhaustion and fading light made the decision for me. I would camp here for the night and try to find my way back to civilization in the morning. I set up my tent just outside the tower, gathered wood for a fire, and tried to eat something, though my appetite had vanished. As darkness fell, the swamp once again grew unnaturally quiet. No insects, no frogs, no birds. Just silence, broken only by the occasional splash in the dark water surrounding the island. I built my fire as large as I dared and sat beside it, my knife in one hand, a heavy branch in the other. The journal I'd found was in my dry bag, and I considered reading more of it to better understand what I was dealing with, but decided against it. Some things are better left unknown. As the night deepened, the silence was broken by a new sound. The fiddle again, but now accompanied by drums and that same rhythmic chanting. It seemed to be coming from all around the pond, surrounding the island. I scanned the shoreline and saw them. Pinpricks of light, dozens of them, moving through the trees. Torches. They were coming for me. I retreated to the tower, hoping its stone walls would provide some protection. Through gaps in the masonry, I watched as boats of various kinds, canoes, flat-bottomed pirogues, even modern kayaks, emerged from the channels around the pond. Each held a figure holding a torch, their faces obscured by what appeared to be crude masks made from animal skulls. They formed a circle around the island, their chanting growing louder. The words were unrecognizable. Not English, not French, not any language I could identify. The music intensified, the fiddle playing a frenzied melody that made my skin crawl. Then, from the largest boat, a figure stood. Unlike the others, this one wore no mask. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong with their proportions. Arms too long, head oddly shaped. They raised their hands and the chanting stopped. In the sudden silence, the figure spoke. The words made no sense to me, but the voice, that voice will haunt me for the rest of my days. It wasn't human. It rasped and bubbled as if spoken through water, yet carried clearly across the pond. When the voice stopped, the others responded with a single word, repeated 3 times. Then they began to paddle toward the island. I retreated deeper into the tower, climbing the spiral staircase built into the wall, hoping to find a defensible position. The staircase led to a small chamber near the top, with narrow windows looking out in all directions. From there, I could see the torchbearers making landfall, forming a procession that wound its way toward the tower. I was trapped. The procession moved slowly, deliberately. Their chanting resumed, but quieter now. They followed the same spiral pattern that was etched into the ground inside the tower, gradually making their way to the center. Then I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Walking among them, between the torchbearers, were figures that didn't hold torches, figures that moved oddly, jerkily, like marionettes with tangled strings. As they came closer, moonlight revealed what they were: human bodies or parts of them, reassembled and animated by some unspeakable means. Their movements weren't their own. Thin strands, like spider silk but darker, extended from their limbs to the fingers of the torchbearers, who manipulated them like puppeteers. The lead figure, the one with the inhuman voice, now stood at the entrance to the tower. In the combined light of the torches, I could see it clearly for the first time. What I had taken for a human in unusual clothing was nothing of the sort. Its body was humanoid but wrong, the proportions distorted, the skin a patchwork of different textures and colors. Its face was the worst part. Features arranged in an approximation of human form but with too many eyes, spread across what should have been a forehead, and a mouth that split its face vertically rather than horizontally. It looked up, somehow knowing exactly where I was hiding, and smiled, that vertical mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. I knew then that the legends had it backward. There was no swamp monster being hunted by humans. There was something ancient in these swamps that hunted humans, something that had taught some of those humans to worship it, to bring it offerings, to help it feed and grow. The thing that called itself the Honey Island Swamp Monster began to climb the stairs. I had nowhere left to run. The chamber I occupied had no other exit besides the staircase. The windows were too narrow to squeeze through, even if I hadn't been 3 stories above the ground. My only weapon was my hunting knife, laughably inadequate against whatever was coming up those stairs. In desperation, I began prying at the stones around one of the windows. Centuries of water damage and neglect had weakened the mortar, and I managed to loosen one block, then another. The opening was still too small, but maybe if I could dislodge one more. The creature reached the chamber. It had to duck to enter, its elongated limbs folding in ways that human joints don't allow. That vertical mouth opened again, emitting that terrible bubbling voice, speaking words I couldn't understand but somehow knew were ancient beyond measure. It reached for me with hands that ended in curved talons rather than fingers. I struck out with my knife, slashing desperately. The blade connected, cutting deep into what should have been a forearm. But instead of blood, a thick, black substance oozed from the wound, more like sap than blood, with a smell like rotting vegetation. The creature didn't flinch. It grabbed my wrist, its grip impossibly strong, and twisted until I dropped the knife. With its other hand, it grasped my throat, lifting me off the ground as if I weighed nothing. Those misplaced eyes studied me with cold intelligence as I struggled for breath. The vertical mouth moved again, but this time I understood the words, though I don't know how. "You will join the others," it said. "Your body will serve. Your spirit will feed." In that moment of absolute terror, with dark spots dancing at the edges of my vision from lack of oxygen, I remembered the loose stones I'd been prying free. With my last reserves of strength, I kicked at the wall beside me. The weakened masonry gave way, sending a shower of heavy blocks cascading down. The creature, caught by surprise, loosened its grip just enough for me to break free. More stones fell as the structural integrity of the already damaged tower began to fail. A gap had opened in the wall, not large enough for a human to fit through normally, but fear and adrenaline make the impossible possible. I dove through the opening just as the upper portion of the tower collapsed entirely. The fall was bad, 20 feet to the ground below, but somehow I managed to land in a way that didn't kill me instantly. Pain exploded in my left leg as it broke on impact, and I felt ribs crack, but I was alive. Behind me, the tower continued to collapse, stone blocks raining down on the creature and the cultists who had gathered below. Their screams mixed with the sound of crumbling masonry, creating a hellish cacophony. I dragged myself away from the destruction, every movement agony due to my broken leg and ribs. I had one chance, to somehow reach my kayak and get off this island before the survivors could reorganize. I crawled through the underbrush using tree trunks to pull myself forward when my arms grew too tired. The sounds of chaos behind me gradually subsided, replaced by that rhythmic chanting once more, different now, angrier. By some miracle, I reached the small beach where I'd left my kayak. It was still there, though the tide had risen, leaving it partially floating. I dragged myself into it, nearly passing out from the pain of moving my broken leg. Using my hands and my one good leg, I pushed away from the shore just as torchlight appeared among the trees. The current caught my kayak, pulling it into the channel I'd arrived through. I had no strength to paddle, could only lie in the bottom of the boat as it drifted, praying the current would take me toward civilization rather than deeper into the swamp. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was looking back at the island, where the torches had gathered on the beach. The tall figure stood at their center, those wrong-placed eyes somehow visible even at a distance, watching me escape. I woke in a hospital 3 days later. A fishing boat had found me drifting near the main channel of Pearl River, delirious from pain and dehydration. My broken bones had been set, my other injuries treated. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive. When I was coherent enough, park rangers came to interview me. I told them about getting lost, about falling from a height when exploring some ruins, careful to omit any mention of monsters or cultists. They nodded sympathetically, clearly believing I was just another tourist who had overestimated his wilderness skills. "You're not the first to get turned around out there," one of them said. "The swamp plays tricks on your mind after a while." I asked if they'd found my dry bags, particularly interested in the journal I'd discovered, which would prove at least part of my story. They exchanged looks. "We didn't find any bags with you, sir," the older ranger said. "Just you and your kayak." Someone, or something, had retrieved my belongings before I was found. As soon as I was able, I researched everything I could about Honey Island Swamp and its history. Most sources repeated the same monster legends I'd already known, but in one obscure academic paper about early colonial settlements, I found a reference to a pagan stone structure discovered by French explorers in 1718, believed to have been built by an indigenous cult that worshipped a being that dwells between worlds, with dominion over water and flesh. The paper included a crude drawing of a symbol found at the site, a circle with a vertical line through it. I've told no one else the full story until now. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I encountered in those backwaters. And I know it's still there, still hunting, still being served by those who have fallen under its influence. Sometimes, in my dreams, I hear that fiddle music again, growing closer, and I wake to find my bedsheets damp with what smells like swamp water, though I live hundreds of miles from Louisiana now. And sometimes when I look in the mirror after those dreams, I swear my eyes have shifted position, just slightly, just enough that no one would notice but me. The doctors say it's PTSD, that the traumatic brain injury I suffered is causing perceptual distortions. They've prescribed medications, therapy, but they don't understand what dwells in Honey Island Swamp. And they don't understand that it's patient. It's had centuries to wait. It can wait a little longer for me. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in August 2024. The humidity of the Louisiana summer clung to my skin like an unwelcome second layer as I pulled my pickup into the small gravel parking area at the trailhead of the Kisatchie National Forest. My chocolate lab, Cooper, whined anxiously from the passenger seat, his paws pressed against the window, eager to stretch his legs after our 3-hour drive from New Orleans. "Almost there, buddy," I said, killing the engine. "Just you and me for the next 5 days." After my divorce 6 months ago, I'd been desperate for something, anything to clear my head. When my therapist suggested I reconnect with nature, I decided to finally attempt the week-long hiking trip through the Kisatchie Bayou Recreation Complex I'd been planning for years. Just me, Cooper, and miles of wilderness between us and civilization. The isolation appealed to me. No cell service, no emails, no awkward conversations with mutual friends about how sorry they were about Rachel leaving. Just silence, save for the sounds of nature and my own thoughts. I checked my backpack one last time. Tent, first aid kit, water purifier, dehydrated meals, compass, map. I'd researched this trail extensively. The Kisatchie had some challenging terrain: cypress tupelo swamps, steep sandstone outcroppings, dense pine forests, but nothing I couldn't handle with my moderate hiking experience. Cooper bounded out of the truck, his tail wagging with infectious enthusiasm. At least one of us was genuinely excited. I clipped on his leash and adjusted my pack, then glanced at the weathered trail map posted on a wooden board nearby. Someone had scrawled something at the bottom in what looked like red marker. "The lady watches from the water, turn back." Vandalism, obviously. Probably local teenagers trying to scare tourists. I dismissed it with a scoff and took a photo of the map with my phone before powering it down to conserve battery. It would only be for emergency use anyway. "Ready, Coop?" I asked, ruffling his ears. He responded with an eager bark, and we set off down the trail that led deep into the forest. The first few hours were exactly what I needed. The trail meandered alongside Kisatchie Bayou, the water dark and still beneath a canopy of ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. Dappled sunlight filtered through, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Cooper trotted happily beside me, occasionally stopping to sniff at something interesting or splash in the shallower portions of the bayou. By mid-afternoon, we'd covered about 7 miles. My shirt was soaked with sweat, but my mind felt clearer than it had in months. I consulted my map and found we were approaching our first planned campsite near Bayou Cypre, a smaller tributary that fed into the main waterway. As we approached the area, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. The sounds of birds and insects that had been our constant companions fell quiet, leaving only the soft squelch of our footsteps on the damp earth. Probably just a weather change coming, I muttered to Cooper, who had slowed his pace and was walking much closer to my leg than before. The campsite was a small clearing about 50 feet from the edge of Bayou Cypre. I dropped my pack and began setting up the tent while Cooper explored the perimeter, nose to the ground. As I hammered in the last stake, I noticed he had stopped at the water's edge, hackles raised, staring intently across the bayou. "Cooper, what is it, boy?" He didn't respond, not even a flick of his ears to acknowledge he'd heard me. I straightened up and walked to his side, following his gaze across the dark water. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a slight movement caught my eye, a patch of white among the cypresses on the opposite bank. I squinted, trying to make it out. Was it cloth caught in the branches? It seemed to be moving too deliberately for that. As I watched, the white shape shifted, and for just a moment, I could have sworn it formed the outline of a woman in a pale dress, standing perfectly still among the trees. I blinked, and the shape was gone. "Just the moss playing tricks," I told Cooper, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to my own ears. "Come on, let's get some dinner going." Cooper reluctantly followed me back to the campsite, but he kept glancing back toward the bayou. I busied myself with starting a small fire and heating water for one of my dehydrated meals, beef stroganoff, which had looked appetizing in the store but now resembled gray sludge as I stirred it with my titanium spork. As dusk settled over the forest, the sounds gradually returned. Frogs, crickets, the occasional splash from the water. I fed Cooper his kibble, and we ate in companionable silence as darkness crept in around us. The fire cast long shadows that danced among the trees, and I found myself repeatedly glancing toward the bayou, half expecting to see that white shape again. After dinner, I cleaned up and secured our food in a bear bag hung from a tree branch away from our camp. Despite the lingering heat, I felt a chill run down my spine as I made my way back to the tent. Cooper was already inside, curled up on his designated corner of the sleeping pad. "Good idea," I said, climbing in beside him and zipping the tent closed. "Early start tomorrow." Sleep came surprisingly easily, the physical exertion of the day pulling me down into darkness. But sometime in the dead of night, I jerked awake, heart pounding. Cooper was standing rigid at the tent door, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Outside, something splashed in the water, not the casual plop of a fish or turtle, but a deliberate, rhythmic sound, like footsteps wading through shallow water. "Cooper, quiet," I whispered, straining to listen. The splashing stopped. For several long moments there was absolute silence. Then, so faint I almost missed it, came a sound that made my blood run cold. Humming. A woman humming a melody I didn't recognize, slow and mournful, coming from the direction of the bayou. Cooper's growl deepened. I placed a hand on his back, feeling his muscles trembling beneath his fur. "It's nothing," I whispered. "Probably just another camper." But I knew that wasn't true. We hadn't seen another soul on the trail, and this was an isolated spot, not an official campground. The humming grew louder, closer. Cooper barked, a sharp warning sound that cut through the night. The humming stopped abruptly. Then came a voice, soft and lilting with a thick Cajun accent. "Mon cher garçon, bring your sweet dog out to play. Evangeline is lonely in the water tonight." Every hair on my body stood on end. Cooper was now snarling, teeth bared at the tent door. "There's nobody out there," I said loudly, trying to convince myself as much as whoever, whatever, might be listening. Go away. A soft laugh drifted through the night air, followed by the sound of splashing water again, this time moving away. Cooper's growling gradually subsided, but he remained alert, staring at the tent door until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the nylon. I barely slept the rest of the night. When morning finally came in earnest, I broke camp quickly, eager to put distance between us and Bayou Cypher. Cooper seemed equally motivated to leave, pulling at his leash as we hit the trail again. Probably just some local trying to scare us, I reasoned aloud as we hiked. Hillbilly idea of a joke. But I couldn't shake the memory of that voice, the way it had seemed to float on the air. Evangeline is lonely in the water tonight. The name tugged at something in my memory, but I couldn't place it. We pushed harder than I'd planned that day, covering nearly 10 miles of increasingly difficult terrain. The trail moved away from the main bayou and up into the sandstone hills that gave Kisatchie its distinctive landscape. By late afternoon, the air had grown noticeably cooler, and dark clouds were building on the horizon. Going to be a storm tonight, I told Cooper as we made camp in a sheltered area beneath an overhang of sandstone. Good thing we've got solid cover. I'd chosen this spot carefully. High ground, away from any water sources with a clear view of the surrounding area. It was irrational, I knew, but I couldn't face another night near the water after our experience at Bayou Cypher. The storm hit just after nightfall, rain lashing against the tent while thunder rolled across the hills. Cooper pressed against my side, trembling slightly with each thunderclap. I stroked his fur absently, listening to the rain and trying to convince myself that last night had been nothing more than my imagination working overtime. "We're fine," I murmured, more to myself than to Cooper. "Just a standard camping trip." As if in direct contradiction to my words, my phone, which should have been powered off in my pack, suddenly chimed. The notification sound for a text message. I froze. There was no cell service out here. I'd verified that before the trip, and I distinctly remembered turning the phone off to save battery. Slowly, I reached for my pack and dug out the phone. The screen was lit up, showing one new message from an unknown number. With a shaking finger, I opened it. "Evangeline is coming up from the water to find you, Daniel." My throat closed up. How did they know my name? How was this message even reaching my phone? Before I could process it, another message appeared. "She doesn't like being abandoned, just like your Rachel didn't." The phone slipped from my numb fingers. Rachel? How could anyone out here know about Rachel? Cooper whined and nudged at my hand. Outside, the storm raged on, but now I heard something else beneath the thunder and rain. That same humming from the night before, barely audible but unmistakable. "It's not real," I whispered. "It's not possible." The humming grew louder, seeming to circle our campsite. Cooper was on his feet now, alternating between growling and whimpering, his eyes fixed on the tent walls as if he could see through them. Then, silhouetted against the tent by a flash of lightning, was the unmistakable shape of a woman. Not just standing nearby, but pressing against the very fabric of the tent, the nylon dimpling inward as if being pushed by hands. "Daniel," came the voice, clearer now despite the storm. "Let me in, mon cher. It's cold in the rain and I've walked so far to find you." I scrambled backward, dragging Cooper with me until we were pressed against the far side of the tent. The silhouette remained, hands now sliding down the nylon with a sound like dry leaves scraping against glass. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. "You know who I am," the voice replied. "Evangeline, the lady of the bayou, the one they left behind." Another flash of lightning, and for just a second, I could see her clearly through the tent fabric. A woman in a tattered white dress, soaking wet, with long dark hair plastered to a face that was somehow both beautiful and terribly wrong. Her eyes were too large, too dark, her smile stretching wider than should be possible. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Company," she said simply. "It's lonely in the water. You look lonely too, Daniel. We could be lonely together." Cooper erupted into frenzied barking, lunging toward the tent wall where the figure pressed against it. In a panic, I grabbed for his collar, but he was faster, tearing at the tent zipper with his teeth until it gave way enough for him to force his head through. "Cooper, no!" I shouted, but he was already squeezing through the opening, barking furiously. Outside, there was a screech. Not human, not animal, but something in between, followed by Cooper's yelp of pain. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and flung myself through the damaged tent door. Rain lashed at my face as I swept the flashlight beam around wildly. Cooper was a few yards away, backing up slowly, still growling. Of the woman, there was no sign. "Cooper, here, boy," I called. He glanced at me but didn't come, his attention fixed on something at the edge of my flashlight's beam. I stepped closer, swinging the light to illuminate what he was staring at. Footprints, small, bare footprints in the mud, leading away from our campsite and down the hill, toward the direction of the nearest water. "Come on," I said, grabbing Cooper's collar. "Back in the tent." He resisted, still growling at the footprints, but eventually allowed me to lead him back. Inside, I examined him quickly with shaking hands. He had a scratch down his muzzle, long but not deep, already clotting. I cleaned it as best I could with water and a clean bandana. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. My phone chimed again from where I'd dropped it. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. "Your dog is brave, but you can't hide behind him forever, Daniel. Water always finds a way in." I turned the phone completely off and removed the battery for good measure, then shoved it deep into my pack. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and confusion. I didn't sleep, just sat with my back against my pack, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, while Cooper kept vigil at the damaged tent door. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with droplets that caught the early morning sun. In the light of day, my fears seemed almost foolish. Almost. The footprints outside were real enough, and Cooper's scratch hadn't been self-inflicted. I decided to abort the trip. We'd hike out today, back to the truck, back to civilization and rational explanations. I broke camp quickly, not bothering with breakfast beyond a protein bar and some water. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed Cooper staring intently down the hill. "What is it, boy?" I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. At the bottom of the hill, just visible among the trees, was a flash of white. Moving. Waiting. "We're not going that way," I decided aloud. "We'll find another route." According to my map, if we headed west instead of south, we would eventually hit an old logging road that ran roughly parallel to the trail we'd come in on. It would be a longer journey back to the trailhead, but it avoided the main bayou almost entirely. We set off at a brisk pace, Cooper unusually subdued at my side. The alternative route was less well marked, requiring careful navigation and frequent checks of my map and compass. By midday, the terrain had become increasingly difficult. Thicker undergrowth, steeper hills, and numerous small streams to cross. During one such crossing, as I was carefully picking my way across slippery stones, Cooper suddenly froze in midstream, staring down at the water. "Cooper, come on, boy." He didn't move, just kept staring at the clear water flowing around his paws. Slowly, I glanced down and nearly lost my footing in shock. It wasn't our reflections that showed in the water. Instead, a woman's face stared up at us from beneath the surface. Pale, with long, dark hair floating around her features and that same too-wide smile. I stumbled backward, dragging Cooper with me. We fell in an ungraceful heap on the bank, and when I frantically looked back at the stream, there was nothing there but clear, flowing water over smooth stones. "We need to get out of here," I gasped. "Now." We practically ran after that, heedless of the scratching undergrowth and treacherous footing. I no longer cared about following the exact route I'd planned. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and that stream. By late afternoon, we were both exhausted. Cooper panting heavily at my side. I had no idea if we were still heading in the right direction. The forest seemed to close in around us, each tree identical to the last, no landmarks to guide us. "We need to stop," I finally admitted, "just long enough to figure out where we are." I found a small clearing and slumped down against a fallen log, pulling out my map and compass with trembling hands. Cooper paced restlessly nearby, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. The map made no sense. According to the compass, we were headed west, which should have brought us to the logging road hours ago. But there was no road, just endless forest. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted around us. As the realization that we were lost sank in, a new sound reached my ears. Water, the gentle gurgle of a stream or small river not far away. "No," I whispered, "that's not possible." But when I forced myself to my feet and walked a few dozen yards toward the sound, there it was, Kisatchie Bayou, its dark waters unmistakable. Somehow, despite hiking west all day, we had circled back to the very thing I was trying to avoid. Cooper refused to approach the water, planting his feet and pulling back on his leash when I tried to get closer to confirm my suspicion. "It's okay," I told him, though it very clearly wasn't. We'll follow it from a distance. The truck is somewhere along this bayou. We'll find it." But as the light began to fade from the sky, I knew we wouldn't reach the trailhead before dark. We needed to make camp again, spend one more night in this nightmare forest. I chose a spot as far from the bayou as I could while still keeping it in sight so we wouldn't lose our way again. My hands shook as I set up the tent, which was still damaged from Cooper's frantic exit the night before. I didn't bother with a fire, partly to avoid attracting attention, partly because the very thought of light and warmth seemed incongruous with the cold dread that had settled in my chest. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest changed. The normal chirping of crickets and croaking of frogs was underlaid by something else, a rhythmic splashing from the direction of the bayou. Cooper heard it too, his ears perking up as a low growl rumbled in his chest. "It's nothing," I said, the lie hollow in the growing darkness. But the splashing grew closer, unmistakable now, the sound of someone wading through water. Then footsteps on dry land, coming toward our camp. Cooper's growl intensified. I fumbled for my flashlight and knife, hands slick with cold sweat. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of our clearing. I could feel something, watching us from the shadows. Cooper was on his feet now, facing the darkness, his body rigid with tension. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm armed." A soft laugh drifted from the darkness. "What will you do with that little knife, mon cher? Cut the water as it rises around you." She stepped into view then. Evangeline, the lady of the bayou. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see her clearly for the first time. She wore a white dress that might once have been beautiful but was now tattered and stained with mud and something darker that looked disturbingly like blood. Her long black hair hung in wet ropes around a face that was both alluring and terrifying. Skin too pale, eyes too dark, that smile too wide to be human. Water dripped constantly from her dress, from her hair, from her fingertips, forming a growing puddle at her bare feet. "What do you want?" I asked, knife pointed uselessly in her direction. "I told you," she said, taking a step closer. "Company. You remind me of him, you know. The one who left me waiting by the water. Promised to return, to take me away from this place." Her expression darkened. "Men always leave, don't they? Your Rachel left you. My Thomas left me." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, backing away slowly. Cooper pressed against my leg. "I don't know any Thomas." "But I know you, Daniel Mercer," she said, taking another step forward. "I know the emptiness inside you, the abandonment. We're the same, you and I." "We're nothing alike," I insisted. "You're not even real." Her laugh was like water bubbling over stones. "Not real? Touch me and see how real I am." She extended one pale hand toward me. Water ran in rivulets down her arm, dripping steadily onto the forest floor. Cooper lunged suddenly, breaking free of my grip on his collar. He charged at Evangeline, barking furiously. She hissed, an inhuman sound, and swept her arm in an arc. Water followed the movement, forming a whip-like stream that caught Cooper mid-lunge and threw him sideways into a tree trunk with a sickening thud. "Cooper!" I screamed as he crumpled to the ground, motionless. Rage replaced fear. I rushed at Evangeline, knife raised. She didn't move, just watched me with those two dark eyes and that terrible smile. As I swung the knife toward her, my blade met no resistance. It passed through her as if she were made of nothing but water. Her hand shot out faster than I could react and closed around my wrist. Her touch was ice-cold and wet, but solid enough to hold me in a grip so strong I couldn't break free. Water began to crawl up my arm from where her hand touched me, soaking through my sleeve, chilling my skin. "The water always finds a way in," she whispered, her face inches from mine. "And once it does, it never leaves." I struggled frantically, dropping the knife to claw at her hand with my free one. My fingers sank into her flesh as if it were made of wet clay, but she didn't release me. The water continued to spread, moving up past my elbow now, each inch it covered growing numb with cold. A weak bark drew both our attentions. Cooper was struggling to his feet, listing to one side but still defiant. He bared his teeth at Evangeline, a low growl building in his chest. "Brave dog," she said, her voice almost admiring. "He loves you. No one ever loved me that way, not even Thomas in the end." Cooper charged again, but this time I could see he was aiming not for Evangeline but for something on the ground near my feet, my fallen knife. He snatched it up in his jaws and darted away, putting distance between himself and Evangeline before turning to face us again, knife clutched firmly in his teeth. The distraction was enough. I wrenched my arm free of Evangeline's grip with a desperate heave and stumbled backward. Water had soaked half my body now, cold as death and heavy as lead. "You can't escape me," Evangeline said calmly. "No one leaves the bayou unless I allow it." "What happened to you?" I asked, trying to buy time as I backed slowly toward Cooper. "Why are you doing this?" A flicker of something, grief perhaps, crossed her face. I waited for him by the water. Days, weeks, as the search parties came and went. They said he'd abandoned me, run off to New Orleans with another woman. I didn't believe them. I waited by the bayou where he'd promised to meet me, to take me away to be married. She glanced toward the water, visible through the trees. Eventually, I stopped waiting on the shore and went into the water to find him myself. Her eyes returned to mine, darker than ever. "The bayou keeps what belongs to it, Daniel, just as it kept me." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it despite my fear. "But I'm not Thomas. I haven't done anything to you." "All men leave," she said simply. "You would leave too, given the chance. Better to keep you here with me, in the water." She began to advance again. I backed up until I reached Cooper, who pressed against my leg, still gripping the knife. I gently took it from his mouth. "Run," I whispered to him. "Find the trail. Go home." But Cooper stood his ground beside me as Evangeline approached. Water seemed to rise with each step she took, pooling around her feet, spreading outward across the forest floor toward us. The air grew thick with humidity, making each breath a struggle. "Please," I tried one last time, "let us go. We won't tell anyone about you." She smiled, that terrible smile. "But I don't want you to go, mon cher. I want you to stay, forever." She lunged forward, hands outstretched. I slashed wildly with the knife, connecting with nothing but air as she seemed to dissolve and reform around my blade. Water engulfed my legs, rising rapidly to my waist, though we were nowhere near the bayou itself. Cooper leapt at her, teeth bared, but she batted him aside with a casual sweep of her arm. He yelped but came right back, circling around to snap at her from another angle. The water continued to rise, now at my chest, though Evangeline stood in it as if it were solid ground beneath her feet. I struggled to keep my footing, to keep my head above the rising flood. "Cooper, run!" I shouted as the water reached my shoulders. To my surprise, he obeyed this time, splashing through the supernatural flood toward higher ground. Evangeline watched him go with that same terrible smile. "He'll come back for you," she said, "and I'll be waiting." The water closed over my head. I thrashed desperately, trying to swim upward, but it was as if the water itself held me down with invisible hands. My lungs burned, vision darkening at the edges as I fought against the impossible flood. Just as consciousness began to fade, something grabbed the back of my shirt, yanking hard. I broke the surface with a desperate gasp, coughing and sputtering. Cooper had my shirt in his teeth, pulling me toward higher ground with all his strength. Evangeline shrieked, a sound like wind through cypress trees, and the water churned around us. Cooper pulled harder, his growl vibrating through his clenched teeth. I began to kick, helping him as best I could, one hand still clutching the knife. "You can't leave," Evangeline wailed, the water surging up in a wave that crashed toward us. But Cooper had dragged me to the base of a large cypress tree. I grabbed a low-hanging branch and pulled myself up, then reached back to haul Cooper up beside me. We climbed higher as the water rose beneath us, Evangeline's furious screams mixing with the sound of rushing water. From our perch, several feet above the forest floor, we watched as the unnatural flood swirled and churned below. At its center stood Evangeline, her form seeming to waver between solid and liquid, her screams growing more distorted. "The bayou keeps what belongs to it," she howled. "You belong to me now." "No," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "I don't." I looked down at my body, at the water that still clung to me, so cold it burned. On a sudden impulse, I raised the knife and cut a deep line across my palm. Blood welled up, bright red in the darkness. "This is what's real," I said, holding my bleeding hand out toward her. "Not your water, not your loneliness. This is life, and it doesn't belong to you or the bayou." I squeezed my fist, letting drops of blood fall into the water below. Where they hit, the water hissed and steamed, creating small clear patches in the flood. Evangeline screamed again, backing away from the falling droplets. "What are you doing?" I didn't fully understand it myself, but something told me I was on the right track. "Proving I'm alive," I said, squeezing harder so more blood dripped down. "Proving I don't belong in your water." Each drop that fell seemed to create a larger clear space in the flood. Cooper whined beside me, nudging at my bleeding hand with his nose. "It's okay, boy," I assured him. "I know what I'm doing." I didn't, not really, but desperation had given me clarity. I climbed down to a lower branch closer to the water but still safely above it, and let my blood drip more directly onto the unnatural flood. Evangeline backed further away, her form flickering more rapidly now between solid and liquid. The water level began to recede, pulling back toward her like a tide returning to the sea. "Life doesn't belong in your ghost water," I said, feeling stronger with each word. "And neither do I." She hissed at me, her beautiful face contorting into something monstrous. "The bayou will keep you eventually," she spat. "If not me, then something else in the water. No one escapes Kisachi forever." The flood receded further, the water level dropping rapidly until only Evangeline remained, standing on suddenly dry ground. She looked different now, more transparent, her edges blurring into the darkness. "He didn't abandon you, did he?" I asked softly, a sudden realization dawning. "Thomas, he died in the bayou, didn't he? That's why he never came back." She stilled, her flickering form stabilizing briefly. "He promised," she whispered, and for a moment I saw not a monster but a young woman, heartbroken and lost. "He promised he would come back for me." "I'm sorry," I said again, "but keeping others in the water won't bring him back." She stared at me for a long moment, her dark eyes fathomless. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the bayou. her form growing more transparent with each step until she simply faded into the darkness. Cooper and I remained in the tree until dawn, neither of us willing to trust that she was truly gone. When the first light of morning filtered through the cypress trees, the forest floor below us was completely dry, as if no flood had ever occurred. We climbed down cautiously. My body ached and my hand throbbed where I'd cut it, but we were alive. Cooper seemed remarkably uninjured despite the rough treatment he'd received, though he stayed closer to my side than ever as we gathered our scattered gear. The tent was ruined, soaked and torn beyond repair. Most of our food was gone as well, either washed away or spoiled by water. But my map and compass had survived in their waterproof case, and more importantly, I now knew where we were. "Let's go home, Cooper," I said, ruffling his ears. "I think we've had enough camping for a while." We found the main trail by mid-morning and reached the trailhead by early afternoon, making much better time now that we were moving with purpose rather than confusion. My truck sat where we'd left it, untouched. As I loaded our remaining gear into the back, Cooper suddenly growled, staring toward the trailhead sign. I followed his gaze to the weathered mapboard where, 3 days earlier, I'd seen that red-scrawled warning. Someone, something, had left a new message beneath it. "She waits still, but not for you, Daniel Mercer." I shivered despite the summer heat, hurrying Cooper into the truck. As we pulled away from Kisatchie National Forest, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror, a flash of white among the cypress trees at the edge of the bayou. I pressed the accelerator harder, not slowing until we hit the highway back to New Orleans. I never returned to Kisatchie, but sometimes when it rains heavily and water pools outside my window, I think I hear humming, a slow, mournful melody that sounds like loneliness itself. And Cooper still won't go near water deeper than his paws. My name is Daniel Reeves, and I am 34 years old. This happened in May 2024. The Atchafalaya Basin had always called to me. Something about its primordial essence, the way the cypress trees rose from black water like ancient sentinels, their knees breaking the surface like the spines of submerged beasts, the way Spanish moss hung like ghosts' fingertips, swaying in breezes that barely stirred the humid air. It was a place where time felt different, stretched and warped like the reflection of the moon on disturbed water. I'd been planning this trip for months. My therapist had suggested reconnecting with nature after my divorce from Emma finalized. 2 years of bitter legal battles had left me hollow, a shell of the person I once was. My apartment in New Orleans had become a prison of sorts, each room containing memories I couldn't escape, each corner holding shadows of a life I no longer lived. "You need to rediscover yourself, Daniel," Dr. Patel had said during our last session. "Remember who you were before all this?" Before all this. Before I found those messages on Emma's phone. Before I discovered that our 5-year marriage had been built on quicksand. Before I realized that the person I'd loved most in the world had been lying to my face for years. I used to be an avid outdoorsman before meeting Emma. Weekends spent hiking and camping had gradually been replaced by dinner parties and social events that Emma deemed more important for our future. Whatever that meant now. So when Dr. Patel suggested I reconnect with my old passions, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. The Atchafalaya Basin, Louisiana's hauntingly beautiful swampland. I'd explored parts of it in my 20s, but had always wanted to venture deeper, to places few people ever saw. Places where cell phones didn't work and GPS signals failed. Places where you could truly be alone with your thoughts. I spent weeks researching, gathering supplies, and creating detailed plans. I would paddle a canoe through the basin, camping on elevated areas for a week. Total isolation, just me and the swamp. The perfect reset for my fractured mind. The morning I set out, the air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin before you've even begun to exert yourself. The public launch at Henderson Levee was mostly empty. just a couple of fishing boats preparing for early morning expeditions. I received curious looks as I unloaded my canoe and supplies from my truck. "Heading out solo?" asked an older man with leathery skin and eyes that had spent decades squinting against the Louisiana sun. "Yes, sir," I replied, securing my waterproof bags. "How long you planning to be out there?" His tone was casual, but I sensed concern beneath the question. "About a week," I said. "Got all the supplies I need." He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting to the vast swampland before us. "Well, stick to the marked channels. Basin has a way of confusing even those who know it well." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "And if you hear voices at night, just stay in your tent." I chuckled, assuming he was trying to spook the city boy. "Voices?" "Basin talks sometimes," he said with a shrug. "Old-timers say it's the spirits of those who got lost and never found their way out. Others say it's just the wind playing tricks." He smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Probably just the wind." I thanked him for the advice, dismissed his warning as local folklore, and set off into the labyrinth of waterways. The first day was everything I had hoped for. The rhythmic dipping of my paddle into the dark water became meditative. Great blue herons stood statuesque among the reeds, barely acknowledging my presence as I glided past. Occasionally, ripples in the water revealed the presence of alligators, a reminder that I was a visitor in their domain. By late afternoon, I reached my first planned camping spot, a small island of relatively dry land near Indian Bayou. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the water and turning the Spanish moss into silhouettes against the amber sky. I set up camp efficiently, having practiced in my backyard before the trip. My lightweight tent was designed for hot, humid conditions with mesh panels for ventilation. I gathered what dry wood I could find and built a small fire, more for companionship than necessity in the warm May evening. As darkness fell, the swamp transformed. What had been merely atmospheric during daylight became something else entirely. A symphony of sounds that seemed both familiar and alien. Bullfrogs croaked their deep, resonant calls. Insects buzzed incessantly. Occasional splashes punctuated the night as unseen creatures moved through the water. I sat by my fire, eating a simple meal of freeze-dried beef stew that tasted far better in the wilderness than it had when I tested it at home. The dancing flames created shifting patterns of light and shadow on the surrounding cypress trunks, making them appear to move, to breathe. That first night, exhausted from paddling and emotionally drained from the anticipation of the trip, I slept soundly. The only dream I remember was of walking through an endless swamp where the trees whispered my name in Emma's voice. I woke to a perfect blue sky and the distinctive call of a barred owl. "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" Despite it being well into morning. Odd for a nocturnal bird, but nature often breaks its own rules. I made coffee using my portable stove and studied my maps, planning the day's journey. I would venture further west, toward a remote area known as Bayou Cheney, site of a ghost town that had been mostly reclaimed by the swamp. The second day of paddling was more challenging. The channels became narrower, sometimes barely wider than my canoe. Fallen cypress limbs created obstacles I had to navigate around. The air seemed thicker here, as if resistant to my intrusion. By midday, sweat soaked my clothes and my arms ached pleasantly from the effort of paddling. I took a break, guiding my canoe to a partially submerged log where I could perch to eat lunch and consult my maps. It was then that I first noticed something odd. The map showed a clear channel heading southwest, but before me were 3 possible routes, none of which perfectly matched what I was seeing on paper. I double-checked my location using my compass and the landmarks I'd noted. Everything suggested I was exactly where I thought I was, yet the waterways didn't match my carefully researched maps. I attributed the discrepancy to seasonal water level changes and chose the middle path, which seemed to head in the general direction I wanted to go. The channel wound through increasingly dense vegetation, the cypresses growing closer together, their moss-draped limbs creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into mottled patterns on the dark water. After an hour of paddling through this green tunnel, the channel widened suddenly into a large, circular pool. In the center stood what appeared to be the remains of a structure, weathered timbers rising from the water in a rough square, suggesting the foundation of an old building. This hadn't been on any of my maps. I paddled closer, curiosity overcoming caution. As I approached, I could see that what I had taken for an abandoned building was actually a platform of sorts, raised about 4 feet above the water on stilts. On top of the platform was what appeared to be an altar, a flat stone surrounded by smaller objects I couldn't immediately identify. Something about the scene made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The air around the platform seemed different, wavering like heat rising from hot asphalt, though the area was shaded by the overhanging cypress branches. As I drew within a few yards, I could see that the objects surrounding the stone were small animal bones, feathers, and dried plants arranged in patterns that clearly weren't random. Strings of what looked like small shells or beads hung from the branches above. This was someone's sacred space, likely a local practitioner of voodoo or some other spiritual tradition. While I was no expert on Louisiana folk religion, I knew enough to respect it and keep my distance. I backed my canoe away, suddenly feeling like an intruder. As I retreated, a sound reached my ears. Soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the ambient noises of the swamp. It grew gradually louder until I could distinguish what it was. Humming. A woman humming a melody that seemed both familiar and foreign, its notes taking unusual turns that created a sense of unease. I scanned the shoreline, the trees, the water around me. Nothing. No one was visible, yet the humming continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and insubstantial in the open space. The humming stopped abruptly. Silence fell, heavier and more absolute than seemed natural. Even the insects had gone quiet. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said into the silence. "I'm just passing through." No response came, but I felt watched, not just by human eyes but by something more pervasive. The swamp itself seemed to be taking my measure. I decided it was time to move on and find my planned camping spot for the night. As I paddled away from the pool, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every few minutes I would turn to look behind me but saw only the empty waterway and the gradually receding view of the mysterious platform. The channel I followed grew narrower again, twisting in ways that didn't match my map. By late afternoon, I had to admit to myself that I wasn't entirely sure of my location. The GPS on my phone showed no signal, which I had expected in parts of the basin, but it was still disconcerting. The sun was getting low, and I needed to find a place to camp soon. After another half hour of paddling, I came upon an elevated area that looked dry enough for a tent. It wasn't one of my planned sites, but it would have to do. As I secured my canoe and began unloading my gear, that unsettled feeling returned, stronger now. Something about this place felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The light filtering through the trees seemed to bend incorrectly. Shadows fell at angles that didn't match their sources. And there was a smell, faint but distinct, like burnt sugar mixed with something metallic. I nearly decided to continue on and find another spot, but darkness was approaching quickly now. Setting up camp in the dark would be challenging and potentially dangerous. I decided to stay, but sleep with my hunting knife close at hand. I made no fire that night. Something instinctual told me it was better not to announce my presence any more than necessary. I ate cold rations in my tent as night enveloped the swamp and brought with it a cacophony of sounds far more intense than the previous evening. The frogs and insects were joined by howls and screeches I couldn't identify. Periodically, the water around my little island would erupt with splashes as though something large was moving just below the surface. Through it all, I had the persistent feeling of being observed. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by unusual sounds and my own anxious thoughts. Around what must have been midnight, I woke suddenly, every muscle tense, though I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. Then I heard it. The humming. The same melody I'd heard at the platform, but closer now. Much closer. It seemed to be coming from just outside my tent. I lay frozen, barely breathing, straining my ears. The humming continued for perhaps a minute, then faded. As it diminished, I heard what sounded like footsteps. A slow, dragging gait moving away from my tent and toward the water. Heart pounding, I fumbled for my flashlight and hunting knife. By the time I mustered the courage to unzip my tent and look outside, there was nothing to see but the night-shrouded swamp. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to show me that I was alone on my small island. At least, alone in any visible sense. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, I packed quickly and was on the water as soon as there was enough light to navigate safely. I abandoned my original plan to venture deeper into the basin. Instead, I would try to find my way back to more trafficked waterways and eventually to the launch point. But the swamp seemed different in the pale morning light. Channels I thought I recognized led to unfamiliar areas. Landmarks I tried to use for navigation, distinctive trees or formations, appeared to have changed position overnight. Increasingly desperate, I consulted my compass repeatedly, only to find that it seemed to be malfunctioning, the needle spinning lazily instead of pointing reliably north. By midday, I had to accept the truth. I was lost. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the Atchafalaya Basin, while vast, was not limitless. If I kept moving, I would eventually find my way to a main waterway or even to the edge of the swamp. I had supplies for several more days. There was no immediate danger. That's what I told myself anyway. As the day progressed, the sky darkened with approaching rain. The air became even more humid, if that was possible, pressing against my skin like a damp cloth. Thunder rumbled in the distance, getting closer with each passing minute. I needed to find shelter before the storm hit. Paddling with renewed urgency, I rounded a bend and saw something that made me pause. A small cabin perched on stilts above the water. Smoke rose from a metal chimney pipe, suggesting occupancy. My first reaction was relief at the prospect of human contact and assistance. My second was wariness. Who would choose to live in such isolation? As I debated whether to approach, the choice was made for me. The rain began, not a gentle introduction, but an immediate deluge that reduced visibility to mere feet. Lightning cracked nearby, followed instantly by a boom of thunder that I felt in my chest. I paddled toward the cabin as quickly as I could. A narrow wooden dock extended from the structure into the water. I maneuvered alongside it and secured my canoe as another flash of lightning illuminated the scene in stark white. In that brief, bright moment, I saw a figure in the doorway of the cabin, watching me. When my vision readjusted to the dimness, the doorway was empty. I gathered my most essential supplies, food, water, first aid kit, knife, and made my way up the rickety steps to the cabin's small porch. The door was ajar. I knocked anyway, the sound barely audible above the rain hammering on the metal roof. "Hello?" I called out. "I'm sorry to intrude. The storm caught me by surprise." No answer came. I pushed the door open wider and peered inside. The cabin consisted of a single room, dimly lit by a kerosene lamp hanging from a central beam. A wood stove occupied one corner, providing the source of the smoke I'd seen. The space was sparsely furnished. A small table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against one wall, some shelves holding jars of unidentifiable contents, bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling, and no one was inside. I stepped in, water dripping from my rain gear onto the wooden floor. "Hello," I called again, wondering if perhaps the occupant was in some unseen storage space or root cellar. Only the patter of rain and rumble of thunder answered me. I moved further into the cabin, noting details that added to my unease. The bed was neatly made, as though ready for use. A pot of something bubbled on the wood stove. A cup on the table still steamed with what looked like tea. Someone had been here moments ago. I considered leaving immediately, storm or no storm, when my eye caught something on the table beside the cup. A photograph. I moved closer to see it better in the dim light. My blood turned to ice. It was a picture of Emma and me on our honeymoon, standing on a beach in Belize, smiling as though nothing would ever come between us. A picture that had been in a frame in our New Orleans apartment. A picture I had thrown away months ago in a fit of anger after finding those messages on her phone. "Do you remember how happy you were?" The voice came from behind me. I spun around, nearly knocking over the chair. An elderly black woman stood in the doorway, rain dripping from an oversized slicker that covered her thin frame. Her face was a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and penetrating beneath heavy lids. She didn't seem at all surprised to find a stranger in her home. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my heart racing. "How did you get this photograph?" "My name is Josephine Thibodeau," she said, closing the door behind her and hanging her wet slicker on a hook. "And the better question is, why did you throw it away?" She moved past me to the stove, seemingly unconcerned by my presence, and stirred whatever was in the pot. "Gumbo," she said without looking at me. "You must be hungry after all that paddling in circles." "I wasn't," I began, then stopped. Had I been paddling in circles? It was possible, given how disoriented I'd become. "Sit," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs. It wasn't a request. "The storm won't pass for hours. You might as well eat." I remained standing. "You didn't answer my question about the photograph." Josephine turned to face me, her expression unreadable. The swamp brings things back sometimes. Things that were lost or discarded, things that still have meaning. She ladled gumbo into a bowl and placed it on the table. "Eat." Something about her tone made compliance seem like the only reasonable option. I sat and took a cautious spoonful of the gumbo. It was delicious, rich and complex with flavors I couldn't identify. "You're lost in more ways than one, Daniel Reeves," Josephine said, pouring herself a cup of tea and sitting opposite me. The fact that she knew my name didn't even surprise me at this point. Nothing about this encounter felt bound by normal rules. "Why am I here?" I asked, the question encompassing more than just my presence in her cabin. "You came looking for something," she replied. "Most people who venture this deep into the basin are searching, whether they know it or not." She sipped her tea, studying me over the rim of her cup. "The question is whether you're ready to find it." "Find what?" "The truth you've been avoiding." Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the cabin in harsh white light. In that instant, Josephine's face seemed to change, her features becoming sharper, less human. But when darkness returned, she appeared normal again, just an elderly woman watching me with knowing eyes. "I don't understand," I said, though a part of me feared that I did. "You blame Emma for the end of your marriage," Josephine said. "You think her betrayal was the poison that killed what you had." I set down my spoon, my appetite suddenly gone. She was cheating on me. For years. Josephine made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "And what were you doing during those years, Daniel? While your wife was seeking elsewhere what she couldn't find at home?" "What are you talking about?" "The long hours at work, the weekends spent looking at screens instead of into her eyes, the conversations where you heard her words but missed their meaning." Josephine leaned forward. "The slow withdrawal of your spirit from the marriage long before she ever looked at another man." Her words hit me like physical blows. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but memories began surfacing. Emma asking me to come to bed instead of staying up late working, her suggesting weekend trips that I always found reasons to postpone, the gradual fade of intimacy that I had attributed to the natural evolution of a long-term relationship. "You don't know anything about us," I said, but my protest sounded hollow even to my own ears. "I know what the swamp shows me," Josephine replied, "and it showed me you, paddling in circles, running from truths you aren't ready to face. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain drummed against the roof and walls. Wind howled through the cypress trees. The cabin creaked as though responding to the pressure. "What do you want from me?" I asked, a tremor in my voice. "It's not about what I want," she said. "It's about what you need. And you need to see." Josephine stood and moved to a cabinet I hadn't noticed before. From it, she withdrew what appeared to be a large, ornate bowl made of dark wood. She placed it on the table between us, then filled it with water from a pitcher. "Look," she commanded. I wanted to refuse, to leave this strange cabin and this unsettling woman with her impossible knowledge. But something compelled me to lean forward and gaze into the water. At first, I saw only my reflection, distorted by the slight movement of the liquid. Then the water seemed to darken, to deepen improbably within the confines of the shallow bowl. My reflection disappeared, replaced by images that moved like a film being projected onto the water's surface. I saw Emma and myself in scenes from our life together, moments I had forgotten or had chosen not to remember. I saw her looking at me with love while I stared at my laptop, unaware of her gaze. I saw her crying alone in our bathroom while I slept obliviously in the next room. I saw a progression of small rejections and missed opportunities, 1,000 tiny abandonments that I had perpetrated without even realizing. And yes, eventually I saw her with him, a colleague from her office. But what the water showed me was not the sordid affair I had imagined. Instead, I saw two lonely people finding comfort in shared unhappiness. I saw Emma struggling with guilt. I saw her trying, repeatedly, to reconnect with me, only to be met with indifference or irritation. "Stop," I whispered, unable to bear any more. "Please." The images faded, leaving only clear water in the bowl. I looked up to find Josephine watching me, her expression now one of compassion. "We create our own hauntings," she said softly. "The ghosts that follow you aren't in the swamp, Daniel. They're in here." She reached across the table and pressed a finger against my chest, directly over my heart. I felt tears on my cheeks, though I didn't remember beginning to cry. The truth Josephine had shown me was devastating in its simplicity. I hadn't lost Emma because she betrayed me. I had lost her through 1,000 small choices of my own, a gradual abandonment disguised as routine. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked through my tears. "It's too late to fix things." "Is it?" Josephine removed her hand from my chest and sat back. "The past can't be changed, but it can be understood. And understanding is the beginning of healing." We sat in silence for some time, the storm raging outside while I weathered my own internal tempest. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. My eyelids grew heavy, and despite my best efforts to stay alert in this strange situation, I felt myself drifting off. "Rest now," I heard Josephine say, her voice seeming to come from far away. "The morning will bring clarity." I don't remember closing my eyes, but I must have slept. Deep, dreamless sleep that felt like sinking into the dark waters of the basin itself. When I opened my eyes, sunlight was streaming through the cabin's small windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind that particular freshness that follows heavy rain. Josephine was nowhere to be seen. I sat up, momentarily disoriented. Had I dreamed the entire encounter? But no, I was definitely in the cabin. The table still held the bowl, now empty, and beside it, the photograph of Emma and me. I picked up the picture, studying our smiling faces. We had been so young, so full of hope and plans for our future. Had I really been the architect of our downfall, building distance between us brick by brick until the gap became unbridgeable? The thought was almost too painful to bear. A folded piece of paper lay beneath where the photograph had been. I opened it to find a hand-drawn map, showing what appeared to be the waterways of the basin. A route was marked in red, with an X indicating what I assumed was my current location, and an arrow pointing to what must be the way out. I looked around the cabin once more, hoping for some sign of Josephine, some explanation for her knowledge or her purpose in helping me. There was nothing, just the simple furnishings I had noticed the night before, except something was different. The jars on the shelves, the bundles of dried plants hanging from the ceiling. They looked old, very old, dust-covered surfaces that had been cleaned the previous evening. The wood stove was cold, showing no signs of recent use. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the implications. How long had this cabin been abandoned? Had Josephine Thibodeau ever really been here? I gathered my things quickly, suddenly eager to be gone from this place. The photograph of Emma and the hand-drawn map went into my pocket. Outside, my canoe was still secured to the dock, exactly as I had left it. The swamp looked different in the morning light, less menacing, more simply what it was, an ancient ecosystem indifferent to human concerns. I studied the map carefully, orienting myself before setting off in the direction indicated by the red line. As I paddled away from the cabin, I couldn't resist looking back. What I saw made me pause mid-stroke. The cabin was still there, but it wasn't as I had seen it the day before. The roof had partially collapsed. Vegetation grew through broken windows. The dock I had just pushed off from was rotted, sections of it missing entirely. It looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. I blinked hard, wondering if lack of sleep was causing me to hallucinate. But the dilapidated state of the cabin remained unchanged. Whatever had happened last night, whatever Josephine had shown me, existed outside the normal boundaries of reality. With a deep breath, I turned my canoe and continued on the route marked on the map. The waterways were clearer now, more defined, as though the confusing maze of channels I had experienced before had been some kind of illusion or test. By midday, I began to see signs of human activity, distant boats, the occasional hunting blind or fishing camp. By late afternoon, I recognized landmarks that told me I was approaching the public launch at Henderson Levee. As I made the final approach to the boat ramp, I saw the same older man who had spoken to me when I set out days earlier. He was securing his fishing boat to a trailer, preparing to leave for the day. When he spotted me, he paused, watching my approach with what appeared to be surprise. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon," he called as I guided my canoe to the concrete ramp. "So soon?" I echoed, confused. "It's been 3 days." He shook his head. "Son, you paddled out yesterday morning. Not even a full day ago." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "That's not possible," I said. "I spent 2 nights in the basin." The man shrugged. "Time plays tricks out there sometimes," he said matter-of-factly, as though discussing something as mundane as the weather, especially around the old Thibodeau place. My heart skipped a beat. "The Thibodeau place?" "Yeah, abandoned cabin about 12 miles southwest of here. Local legend says old Josephine Thibodeau was a traiteur, a healer who practiced folk medicine. Some called her a witch." He secured the final strap on his boat. "Story goes that she would help lost travelers in the basin, but only those who were truly lost, whatever that means." "When did she die?" I asked, my mouth dry. He looked at me curiously. "Die? No one knows for sure she ever did, but the cabin's been empty since the 1950s at least. My grandfather knew her, said she was old even then." He studied my face for a moment. "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." Perhaps I had. Or perhaps I had seen something more complicated than a ghost, a manifestation of the swamp's strange power, or of my own subconscious need for reckoning. "Thank you for the information," I said, deflecting his unspoken question. "I appreciate it." As I loaded my canoe onto my own vehicle, I felt the weight of the photograph in my pocket. I took it out, studying Emma's smile in the sunlight. Whatever had happened in that cabin, hallucination, supernatural encounter, or some blend of both, it had forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding. The swamp had shown me what I needed to see. Driving back to New Orleans, I made a decision. I would call Emma, not to try to rekindle what we had lost, Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, but to offer her something I should have given her long ago. An honest accounting of my own failings and a sincere apology for my part in our downfall. It would be a beginning. Not of reconciliation, necessarily, but of healing. Of finally moving forward instead of paddling in endless circles of blame and regret. As the highway carried me away from the Atchafalaya Basin, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw an elderly woman standing by the roadside, watching my departure with knowing eyes. When I looked again, there was only the swamp, ancient, mysterious, and indifferent to the brief passages of human lives across its timeless surface. But somewhere in its depths, Josephine Thibodeau was still stirring her gumbo, waiting for the next lost soul to find their way to her door. My name is Daniel Matthews, and I am 34 years old. This happened in June 2023. Looking back, I should have known better than to venture into Honey Island Swamp alone. As a nature photographer specializing in wetland ecosystems, I'd convinced myself that my experience would keep me safe. I'd explored swamps across Florida and Georgia for years, documenting their haunting beauty and diverse wildlife. But Louisiana's swamps were different, ancient and secretive, hiding things that should remain hidden. The locals in Slidell had warned me. Honey Island ain't like other swamps, the elderly man at the gas station had said, his weathered face creasing with concern. There's parts of it no one comes back from, places where the water runs black and even the gators won't go. I'd smiled politely, attributing his warnings to local superstition. Now, as I sit in this sterile hospital room with bandages covering what remains of my left leg, I wish I had listened. It started as a week-long solo expedition. My girlfriend, Meredith, had recently ended our 3-year relationship, claiming I was more married to my camera than to her. Maybe she was right. Photography was my escape, my way of making sense of the world. When everything else felt chaotic, peering through that viewfinder gave me control, purpose. After the breakup, I threw myself into planning this trip. Honey Island Swamp, with its 70,000 acres of pristine wetlands, was rumored to harbor some of the most spectacular biodiversity in the South. I'd heard whispers of rare orchids that bloomed only at night, albino alligators that glowed in the moonlight, and if local legends were to be believed, the infamous Honey Island Swamp Monster. I'd laughed at that last part. 20 years as a wildlife photographer had taught me that monsters existed only in the human imagination. Nature was brutal, yes, but never malevolent. It simply was. God, how wrong I was. I arrived in Slidell on a sweltering Tuesday, the air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. After stocking up on supplies, water purification tablets, freeze-dried meals, extra batteries, and enough bug spray to drown a small animal, I checked into a motel on the outskirts of town. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, raised an eyebrow when I mentioned my destination. Honey Island? Going with a guide, I hope? Solo trip, I replied, signing the registration form. Been doing this for years. She handed me the room key, her fingers lingering a moment too long. Just be careful about the Stillwater Bayou area, deep in the eastern part. Folks who go there tend to find things they weren't looking for. I nodded politely but mentally filed her warning with the others. Colorful local folklore designed to scare tourists. That night, I laid out my equipment. My Canon EOS R5 with various lenses, a drone for aerial shots, waterproof cases, GPS units, and detailed topographical maps. Everything had its place in my specialized backpack. Control and preparation, as always. The next morning, I drove my rented Jeep to a small dock where I'd arranged to pick up a kayak. The rental owner, a stringy man named Tobias with leathery skin and a permanent squint, looked me up and down with obvious skepticism. "How long you planning to stay out there?" he asked, helping me secure the kayak to my Jeep's roof rack. 5 days, maybe a week if the shooting's good." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the water. "You got a satellite phone? Regular cells don't work out there past the first few miles. I patted the waterproof pouch on my belt. Got one, and emergency beacons too. Tobias nodded, seemingly satisfied. Stay on the marked waterways, he advised, and if you hear something calling your name that ain't human, paddle the other way. Fast. I laughed. Is that what happened to the Honey Island monster? Someone called its name? His face hardened. Nothing funny about what lives in those waters, city boy. Some things in this world science ain't got no explanation for. He handed me a small cloth bag that smelled of herbs and something metallic. Keep this with you. Don't open it. I took it reluctantly, planning to discard it once I was out of sight. What is it? Protection, he said simply, turning away to indicate our conversation was over. 2 hours later, I launched my kayak into the murky waters of Honey Island Swamp. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of cypress trees draped with Spanish moss, casting mottled shadows on the tea-colored water. The stillness was immediately striking. No wind, just the occasional plop of a jumping fish or the distant call of a bird. I paddled steadily, following the main waterway. My goal was to reach a remote area known as Pearl River Basin by nightfall, where I'd set up my first camp. The swamp unfolded around me like a primeval world. Massive cypresses rose from the water, their knobby knees breaking the surface like arthritic fingers. Turtles sunned themselves on fallen logs, sliding into the water with soft plunks as I approached. By midday, I'd already captured spectacular shots: an osprey diving for fish, a blue heron standing motionless in the shallows, and a young alligator basking in a patch of sunlight. The heat was oppressive, my shirt soaked with sweat, but I felt alive. This was what I lived for. These moments of perfect communion with nature, just me and my camera witnessing beauty few ever saw. Around 4 o'clock, I noticed the waterway branching. According to my map, the right fork led to Pearl River Basin, my intended destination. But something about the left fork called to me, a narrower passage that twisted deeper into the swamp, where the trees grew so close they formed a tunnel of green shadow. My logical mind said to stick to the plan, but 20 years of photography had taught me to follow my instincts when it came to finding the perfect shot. I turned left. The channel narrowed as I progressed, forcing me to duck under low-hanging branches. The water darkened from amber to nearly black, and the usual swamp sounds — birds, insects, the rustle of small animals — gradually faded until all I could hear was the gentle dip of my paddle and my own breathing. After about an hour of navigating the increasingly constricted waterway, the passage suddenly opened into a circular pool maybe 100 feet across. In the center stood a small island dominated by an enormous cypress, larger than any I'd ever seen. Its massive trunk must have been at least 12 feet in diameter, twisted and gnarled with age. What caught my attention, however, were the markings carved into its bark, symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in spiral patterns that seemed to pulse slightly in my peripheral vision, but remained static when I looked directly at them. I checked my GPS. Nothing. The screen showed only static. Same with my satellite phone. No signal. I should have turned back then, but the photographer in me couldn't resist. The setting sun cast the island in a golden glow, and the massive tree with its mysterious carvings would make a stunning centerpiece for my portfolio. I paddled to the edge of the small island and secured my kayak to an exposed root. The ground felt unnaturally spongy under my boots, not solid enough to be land, but not quite muddy either. It yielded slightly with each step, as if breathing. I dismissed the sensation as an effect of the unstable bog surface and approached the great tree, camera ready. Up close, the carvings were even more intricate, whorls and angular shapes that seemed to form a language. Some looked almost like primitive depictions of human figures, but distorted, elongated. I snapped dozens of photos, switching lenses to capture both the overall patterns and the fine details. As the light faded, I set up my tripod for some long exposure shots that would capture the tree in the gathering dusk. That's when I first heard it. A sound so subtle I almost missed it beneath the clicks of my camera. A whisper, not quite words, more like the suggestion of words. I paused, listening. Nothing. I continued shooting, adjusting my settings for the dimming light. Daniel. I spun around, heart suddenly hammering. My name had been spoken clearly, not in a whisper, but in a voice that sounded like dozens of voices layered together, some high and childlike, others deep and guttural. "Hello," I called, scanning the darkening swamp. No response. Uneasiness crept along my spine. I was at least 10 miles from the nearest tour route, in an area not marked on any recreational maps. No one should be here. Daniel Matthews. This time the voices seemed to come from behind me, from the direction of the great cypress. I turned slowly, my breathing shallow. The carved symbols on the tree's bark appeared to shift subtly in the twilight, rearranging themselves when not directly observed. Ridiculous, I told myself. A trick of the fading light and an overactive imagination. I decided it was time to make camp. Normally, I would have paddled back to the main waterway before setting up for the night, but darkness was falling quickly, and navigating the narrow channel in the dark would be dangerous. I'd sleep here and leave at first light. I chose a spot about 20 feet from the great tree, on the highest ground I could find. As I set up my small tent, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The usual nighttime swamp chorus, frogs, insects, nocturnal birds, was absent. The silence pressed against my ears like a physical weight. Inside my tent, I reviewed the day's photos on my camera's LCD screen. The shots of the carved tree had turned out beautifully, the symbols stark against the textured bark. But as I zoomed in on one particular section, my blood froze. There, partially hidden in a knot of the wood, was what appeared to be a face. Not carved, but somehow part of the tree itself. A gaunt, elongated human face with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched open in what might have been a scream or a grotesque smile. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. I'd photographed enough twisted tree trunks and gnarled roots to know how easily they could resemble human features in the right light. But no matter how I rationalized, I couldn't dismiss the deep wrongness I felt. I zipped my tent closed and tried to sleep, my hand resting on the small knife I always carried. The protective charm Tobias had given me lay forgotten in my backpack's side pocket. Sleep came fitfully, disturbed by dreams of sinking into black water while countless hands pulled me down. I woke several times, disoriented, convinced I'd heard my name being called. Around what must have been midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound I couldn't immediately place. A wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across sodden ground. It circled my tent, pausing occasionally. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed to remain silent, to pretend I wasn't there. The dragging stopped directly outside my tent. I could see a shadow outlined against the nylon, something large and misshapen. Not a person, not an animal I could identify. The shadow stayed motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then it slowly moved away. I didn't sleep again that night. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, I packed my gear with trembling hands. Whatever I'd heard, whatever had stood outside my tent, had left no tracks in the spongy soil. That somehow frightened me more than if I'd found footprints. I launched my kayak into the black water, eager to leave the island and its ancient tree behind, but as I paddled toward the channel I'd entered through, I found it was gone. Where the narrow passage had been was now only a solid wall of cypress and tangled underbrush. I circled the entire pool twice, growing increasingly frantic. Impossible as it seemed, the way I'd come in no longer existed. I consulted my compass, determined to paddle east where I knew the main waterway must be. But the needle spun aimlessly, settling briefly in random directions before spinning again. My GPS still showed nothing but static. Fighting down rising panic, I chose a direction that seemed most likely to lead to wider waters and started paddling. The morning mist clung to the surface, obscuring anything more than 20 feet ahead. I navigated cautiously, aware that what looked like open water could conceal submerged logs or other hazards. After an hour of slow progress, the mist began to thin. I found myself in another circular pool nearly identical to the one I'd left, complete with a central island and massive cypress tree. For a disorienting moment, I thought I'd somehow circled back, but this tree bore no carvings. Instead, it was draped with what looked like dozens of small cloth bags similar to the one Tobias had given me. I approached cautiously, drawing my kayak up on the small island. The bags hung from the branches at various heights, gently swaying though there was no breeze. As I moved closer, I could see that each was stained dark at the bottom, the cloth discolored as if soaked repeatedly in something that had dried. The smell hit me then, copper and decay, the unmistakable stench of old blood. My heart hammered against my ribs. These were charm bags, like the one in my backpack, but these had been used. Used for what? I didn't want to know. I backed away, eager to return to my kayak when my foot struck something half buried in the spongy ground. I looked down. A camera. Not just any camera, but a Canon EOS R5, identical to mine. I knelt and pulled it from the muck. The lens was shattered, the body dented, but the memory card slot appeared intact. With shaking fingers, I extracted the card and inserted it into my own camera to view its contents. The most recent image made my stomach lurch. It showed this very island, this very tree with its hanging bags. But standing among them was a figure, tall and emaciated, its skin a mottled gray-green that blended with the bark. The face was the same one I'd glimpsed in the patterns of the first tree, elongated, with a too-wide mouth and hollow eyes. In its spindly arms, it cradled what looked like a freshly made charm bag, dark liquid dripping from its bottom. The creation date on the file, March 15th, 2023, just 3 months ago. I dropped the camera as if it had burned me and scrambled back to my kayak. As I was about to launch, I noticed something scratched into a flat stone near the water's edge. 2 words, still water. Stillwater Bayou. The area the motel receptionist had specifically warned me about. I paddled with renewed urgency, choosing a channel leading away from the island that seemed wider than the others. The sun had risen higher now, burning off the morning mist and revealing the swamp in all its eerie beauty. Under different circumstances, I would have been taking photos of the light filtering through the Spanish moss, creating natural spotlights on the dark water. The channel gradually widened and I began to hear familiar swamp sounds again. The croak of frogs, the buzzing of insects. My spirits lifted slightly. Perhaps I was finding my way back to the main waterway. Around noon, I spotted a wooden structure ahead, a weather-beaten dock extending from what appeared to be solid ground. Beyond it stood a small cabin partly concealed by vegetation. Relief flooded through me. Civilization. Someone who could point me back toward Slidell. I approached the dock cautiously. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone there? I need some help." No response. I tied my kayak to one of the pilings and climbed onto the warped boards. The dock creaked ominously but held my weight. As I got closer to the cabin, I noticed details that dampened my initial relief. The windows were dark, some broken. The door hung askew on rusted hinges. This place had been abandoned for years. Still, it might contain something useful. A map, perhaps, or supplies. I approached the tilting structure, the boards of the small porch groaning beneath my feet. The door swung open at my touch, revealing a single room in a state of chaos. Furniture lay overturned, shelves emptied onto the floor. In the center, a metal wood stove stood open, its interior filled not with ashes but with dozens of small animal bones. On the wall above a narrow cot hung a crude map drawn on what appeared to be animal hide rather than paper. It depicted the swamp, or a portion of it, with X marks at various locations. One area was circled repeatedly in what looked like dried blood, with the words, "They come from here," scrawled beside it. My skin crawled. I was about to leave when something caught my eye, a journal bound in cracked leather, lying half-hidden beneath the cot. I picked it up, brushing off dust and spiderwebs. The journal belonged to someone named Thomas Grayson, who described himself as a biologist studying the unique ecosystem of Honey Island Swamp. The early entries were scientific observations, notes on plant species, animal behaviors, water quality. But as the journal progressed, the handwriting became increasingly erratic, the content disturbing. Day 47. Found another tree with the markings. That makes 5. They form a pattern across the swamp. A pentagram? Something geometric, certainly intentional. These aren't random carvings by bored hunters. They're old, very old. The locals won't talk about them. Day 53. The sounds continue. Not animal, not human either. Something between. They know my name now. They call to me at night. Day 58. I've seen them. Christ help me, I've seen them. They're not the swamp monster of local legend. Worse, much worse. They were human once, I think. The way they move, like they're not fully in this world, they're doing something with the blood, taking people, using their blood to make those charm bags that hang on the trees. Some kind of ritual. The trees are gates. They mark the thin places. The final entry was a frantic scrawl. They're coming. Don't trust the water. It's not water anymore. They're in it. They are it. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my kayak paddle as I practically ran back to the dock. The rational part of my mind insisted there must be a logical explanation. Perhaps Grayson had experienced toxic mold exposure or had consumed contaminated water that caused hallucinations. Or maybe this was an elaborate hoax left to frighten tourists. But I couldn't dismiss what I'd seen myself. The vanishing channel, the identical camera, the strange silence that fell over parts of the swamp, and those whispers speaking my name. How could Grayson have known about those? Back in my kayak, I studied the crude map I'd found, trying to orient myself. If the X marks indicated the locations of the carved trees, and the circled area was where they came from, then the quickest route back to civilization would be to head southwest. I checked my compass again. Still useless, the needle spinning lazily. I'd have to navigate by the sun. I paddled for hours, the swamp seemingly endless. The channels twisted and turned, sometimes opening into larger pools, other times narrowing until branches scraped both sides of my kayak. I began to notice strange disturbances in the water, not the typical ripples of fish or alligators, but circular patterns that spread outward from points of stillness, as if something was rising from the depths but stopping just below the surface. Late in the afternoon, exhaustion and hunger forced me to stop. I found a small hummock, a raised area solid enough to support my weight, and pulled my kayak ashore. After eating some of my dwindling supplies, I checked my satellite phone again. Still no signal. The emergency beacon likewise appeared dead. I was completely cut off. As the light began to fade, I faced a difficult decision. Traveling through the swamp at night was dangerous, but I was increasingly certain that spending another night here would be worse. I decided to push on, using my headlamp to navigate. That was my second mistake. The first was turning left at that initial fork. Night in the swamp transformed everything. My headlamp created a small bubble of visibility beyond which lurked absolute darkness. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of the light, retreating when I turned to look directly at them. The water, black as oil now, occasionally rippled as if disturbed from below. I had been paddling for perhaps an hour when I heard splashing behind me. Steady, rhythmic sounds like someone following in another boat. I swung my headlamp around. Nothing but empty water, the light reflecting off the obsidian surface. The splashing stopped while my light was trained on the area. then resumed the moment I faced forward again. My arms burned with the effort of paddling faster, every nerve screaming with the certainty that something was closing the distance between us. Ahead, I spotted what appeared to be light. Warm, yellow light that could only mean human habitation. Hope surged through me. I paddled frantically toward it, the splashing behind me growing louder, closer. The light resolved into a lantern hanging from a post beside another dock, this one in better repair than the abandoned cabins. Beyond it stood a small house on stilts, windows glowing welcomingly. I could have wept with relief. "Hello," I shouted as I approached. "I need help, please." The door of the house opened and a figure stepped onto the porch. An old woman, stooped but sturdy, peered down at me. "Who's out there at this hour?" Her voice was thick with the local accent. "My name is Daniel Matthews. I'm lost. Been trying to find my way back to Slidell since this morning." She was silent for a moment, then, "Tie up and come inside, Mr. Matthews. You look half dead." I secured my kayak and climbed the steps to her porch, my legs wobbly after so many hours of sitting. Up close, I could see she was ancient, her dark skin deeply creased, her white hair tied back in a tight bun. She wore a simple dress and a necklace made of what looked like alligator teeth and small bones. "Thank you," I said, following her inside. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't seen your light." The interior of the one-room house was meticulously clean, lit by oil lamps that cast a warm glow over simple furnishings. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with an aromatic scent that didn't quite mask an underlying metallic smell reminiscent of the charm bags. "You're a long way from where you should be," she said, gesturing for me to sit at a small table. "Honey Island doesn't take kindly to strangers wandering its secret places." "I'm a photographer," I explained. "I was documenting the wildlife, but I got turned around somehow. The channels seem to change." "They do," she agreed, placing a cup of steaming liquid before me. "Drink. It will help with the fatigue." I hesitated, eyeing the dark brew. She chuckled, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "If I wanted to harm you, Mr. Matthews, I'd have let what was following you catch up." That decided me. I sipped the bitter liquid, which tasted of herbs and something else I couldn't identify. "You've been to the marked trees," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, too exhausted to deny it. "What are they? What's happening in this swamp?" She settled into a chair across from me, her dark eyes evaluating. "This land has always been a thin place, a place where the barrier between worlds isn't as solid as it should be. The Choctaw knew it. The first European settlers learned it, often too late." "What's on the other side?" I asked, the drink spreading warmth through my limbs, dulling the edge of my fear. "Not what? Who?" She leaned forward. "They were a cult, back in the early days of settlement, practiced dark magic, blood magic. Found that the swamp amplified their powers. When the other settlers finally realized what they were doing with those who went missing, they hunted the cult down, hanged them all from the cypress trees they'd carved their symbols into." I swallowed hard. "But they're still here somehow?" Death didn't end their connection to whatever they'd contacted from the other side. Their spirits merged with the swamp itself. The water, the trees, the mist. They're still practicing their rituals, still seeking to bring their dark god fully into this world. They need blood for that. Fresh blood. "The charm bags," I whispered. She nodded. "Protection, if made right. Sacrifice, if made by them." I thought of the countless bags hanging from the tree, each stained dark at the bottom. How many people had vanished into this swamp over the years? "How do I get out?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "At dawn, I'll give you directions that will lead you back to the main waterway. You'll need to leave your camera behind." "What? Why?" "The images you've captured, the symbols on the trees. They're conduits. Having them with you is like carrying an open doorway. They've already used them to track you, to learn your name." She reached across the table, her bony fingers surprisingly strong as they gripped my wrist. "They marked you the moment you photographed their signs. That's how they choose who to take." I thought of the identical camera I'd found half buried by the second tree. Another photographer, just like me. "But my work, your life," she countered firmly. "The memory card, too. Everything with their marks on it stays here." I wanted to argue but was interrupted by a sound outside. That same wet, dragging noise I'd heard circling my tent the night before. The old woman stiffened, her eyes darting to the windows which were now covered with what looked like heavy burlap. "They found you," she whispered. "They followed you here." She moved with surprising speed to a trunk in the corner, extracting packets of herbs and small animal bones. "Help me put these at the windows and door," she instructed, pressing several into my hands. "Quickly!" We worked in tense silence, placing the strange bundles at each potential entrance. The dragging sound circled the house, pausing occasionally as if testing for weaknesses. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. "Will these keep them out?" I asked, nodding toward the bundles. "For tonight," she said grimly. "But they're patient, and you've stirred them up by visiting both marked trees in such a short time. They haven't fed well lately." A soft thump came from the roof, then another, the scratching of what sounded like claws or long fingernails. The old woman muttered something under her breath that might have been a prayer or an incantation. "Who are you?" I asked suddenly. "Why do you live out here, so close to them?" Her smile was without humor. "Someone has to remember. Someone has to warn the ones who might listen." She touched the necklace of teeth and bones. "My grandmother was Choctaw. She taught me the old ways, how to protect against the dark things that live in between places. I'm the last one who knows." Throughout the night, the creatures continued their attempts to enter, testing the door, scraping at the windows, even probing the floorboards from underneath the house. The old woman, who eventually told me her name was Agnes, maintained a constant vigil, refreshing the protective bundles whenever the sounds grew too close. I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion because I woke with a start to find morning light filtering through the cracks in the window coverings. The sounds had stopped. Agnes sat in her chair, looking as if she hadn't moved all night. "They've retreated for now," she said. "Sunrise weakens them, forces them back to their anchors, the marked trees, but they'll be watching the waterways." She gave me detailed directions back to the main channel, along with a fresh charm bag to hang from my kayak's bow. "Leave the camera," she reminded me as I gathered my remaining gear, "and if you make it out, don't ever come back to Honey Island. They never forget a face or a name once they've learned it." I hesitated, my photographer's instinct rebelling at the thought of abandoning my equipment and the images I'd captured. But reason prevailed. I placed the camera on her table. "What will you do with it?" I asked. "Burn it, along with the other things they've used to mark their victims." She walked me to the door. "Go now, while the light is strong. Follow the sun. Don't look back if you hear your name." I thanked her and descended to my kayak, the charm bag clutched tightly in my hand. As I was about to push off, a thought struck me. "Agnes, how did you know my full name last night? I only told you my first name when I arrived." The old woman's expression didn't change. Did I? An old woman's memory plays tricks sometimes. A chill ran through me despite the morning warmth, but I had no choice but to continue. I hung the charm bag from my kayak's bow as instructed and began paddling in the direction she'd indicated. The morning swamp was eerily beautiful, mist rising from the dark water in ghostly tendrils. I followed Agnes's directions carefully, marking my progress by distinctive trees and formations she'd described. The channels seemed more stable in daylight, maintaining their course instead of shifting mysteriously as they had the day before. After several hours of steady paddling, I began to hear distant voices and the occasional mechanical sound of boat motors. Civilization. The sounds grew louder as I continued, confirming I was headed in the right direction. Hope renewed my energy. That's when I heard the whispers again. Daniel, Daniel Matthews. Stay with us, Daniel. The voices seemed to come from the water itself, rising around my kayak like invisible mist. I paddled faster, my arms burning with effort. We have your camera, Daniel. All your beautiful pictures. Don't you want them back? Agnes had my camera. I'd left it on her table. Unless... A horrible suspicion bloomed. I reached for the charm bag hanging from my kayak's bow, my fingers trembling as I loosened the drawstring and looked inside. Human teeth. Small, yellowed with age. A child's teeth. I dropped the bag into the water with a cry of revulsion. Immediately, the surface began to bubble and roil around it, black water turning even darker, thickening like tar. From the churning mass rose a form, humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted, limbs too long and jointed in too many places. The face was the one I'd seen in the tree and in the photograph, elongated with hollow eyes and that terrible wide mouth. In its spindly hand, it held my camera. Agnes sends her regards, it said in that multi-layered voice, sounding like dozens of people speaking in unison. She's been our gatekeeper for almost 60 years now, sends us the occasional photographer, hiker, lost tourist, keeps us fed. I scrambled to turn my kayak to flee back the way I'd come, but found myself surrounded. The black water had risen into similar figures on all sides, their twisted bodies blocking any escape. Their elongated arms reached for me, fingers like white roots dripping dark water. I fought wildly as they capsized my kayak, thrashing in the suddenly thick water that pulled me down like hands. Something sharp, a knife or claw, sliced into my left leg, sending a bolt of agony up my spine. The water around me bloomed red with my blood. As consciousness began to fade, I saw them collecting the spreading cloud of my blood in small cloth bags, their movements almost ceremonial. My last thought before the darkness took me was that I should have listened to the warnings. I should never have turned left at that fork. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Slidell, minus my left leg below the knee. The doctors told me I'd been found floating face up in a channel frequently used by tour boats, barely alive from blood loss caused by what they assumed was an alligator attack. My equipment was gone, my story of carved trees and whispering water dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. Sometimes in the dark of night I can still hear them whispering my name. I've moved since then, changed my number, even considered changing my name. But deep down, I know it wouldn't matter. They know me now. They've tasted my blood. And sometimes when I look at the photographs other people take of swamps, any swamps, I can see them hiding in the shadows between the trees, patient and hungry, waiting for someone else who doesn't listen to warnings, someone else who will turn left when they should turn right. If you're reading this and planning a trip to Honey Island Swamp, take my advice. Stick to the tour boats, stay in the well-traveled areas, and if a kind old woman living alone offers you shelter for the night, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because in Honey Island, darkness isn't just the absence of light. It's alive, and it knows your name. My name is Elijah Mitchell, and I am 34 years old. This happened in October 2023. I've never been good at staying in one place. After my divorce, that restlessness only grew worse. The suffocating walls of my apartment in New Orleans seemed to close in a little more each day. That's why I took up hiking, to escape, to breathe, to outrun the thoughts that chased me through sleepless nights. When my therapist suggested I try a multi-day wilderness trek to reset my nervous system, it seemed like exactly what I needed. Isolation can be clarifying, Dr. Reynolds had said. Sometimes we need to step away from everything to see what truly matters. I chose Honey Island Swamp, about 40 miles northeast of New Orleans. Despite growing up in Louisiana, I'd never explored its 70,000 acres of mysterious wetlands. The locals called it one of the most pristine swamplands in the country, with hidden trails that few tourists ever discovered. Perfect for someone wanting to disappear for a while. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, water filtration system, first aid kit, food for 4 days, and my father's hunting knife, the only thing of his I kept after he died. My ex-wife, Sarah, would have called this whole expedition another avoidance strategy. Maybe she was right, but avoidance was all I had left. The October morning I set out was unseasonably cool. The sky a perfect cloudless blue that felt like a good omen. I parked at the Pearl River Eco Tours office where a weathered guide named Roy looked at me with undisguised skepticism. "Solo hiking in Honey Island? You familiar with these swamps?" His voice was gravel wrapped in cigarette smoke. "I've done my research," I replied, which wasn't exactly a lie. I'd read everything I could find online about the area, plotted my route along established trails, and downloaded offline maps. Roy's leathery face creased. "Research ain't experience. These swamps don't forgive mistakes." He pointed toward the trailhead. "Stick to the marked paths. Some areas out there ain't been properly mapped. And watch for the usual: cottonmouths, gators, wild hogs." He paused, chewing his lip like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. "What about the Honey Island swamp monster?" I joked, referencing the local legend of a 7-foot bipedal creature that supposedly roamed these wetlands. Roy didn't smile. "Folks disappear out there every few years. Sometimes we find 'em, sometimes we don't. Monster or no monster, respect the swamp." He handed me a small leather pouch. "Local tradition, protection charm, humor an old man." I slipped it into my pocket with a nod of thanks and headed toward the trailhead. The first few hours were exhilarating. The narrow path wound between cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, their knobby knees protruding from the dark water. Sunlight dappled through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. Birds called from unseen perches. Occasionally, ripples in the nearby water betrayed the movement of unseen creatures. By mid-afternoon, I'd covered about 8 miles and found a perfect camping spot on a dry ridge overlooking a small bayou. The ground was firm, important in a swamp, and I could see in all directions, which made it feel secure. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and watched the sunset paint the cypress trees in hues of orange and pink. As darkness fell, the swamp transformed. The daytime symphony of birds gave way to a chorus of frogs and insects. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The fire crackled, pushing back the encroaching shadows. I felt my muscles relax for the first time in months, tension draining from my shoulders as I stared into the flames. That's when I first heard it, a sound like someone dragging something heavy through the underbrush. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for my father's knife. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by silence. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I convinced myself it was just a wild hog or maybe an alligator moving between pools. Sleep came reluctantly that night, my dreams fractured by the unfamiliar sounds of the swamp. I woke several times, once bolting upright, certain I'd heard my name whispered just outside my tent. The protection charm Roy had given me lay on the ground beside my sleeping bag. I picked it up, feeling foolish but comforted by its presence nonetheless. The second day dawned misty and gray. The humidity clung to everything, making my clothes feel perpetually damp. I packed up camp and continued deeper into the swamp, following a trail that grew increasingly faint. The map showed it connecting to a larger path about 5 miles ahead, near an area called Devil's Landing. By noon, the trail began to disappear entirely. What had been clear path now looked like any other section of swampland. I checked my phone's GPS, but the signal kept dropping, the blue dot jumping erratically across the screen. A flutter of unease stirred in my chest. I took a deep breath and oriented myself by the sun, heading in what I hoped was still the right direction. The landscape grew more disorienting with each step. The cypress trees here were ancient giants, their massive trunks creating a maze that all looked the same. Water levels rose, forcing me to wade through sections up to my knees. The bottom was treacherous, sometimes firm, sometimes sucking at my boots like hungry mouths. I stopped to rest on a fallen log and check my bearings. The sun had disappeared behind thickening clouds, removing my one reliable navigational aid. According to my now functioning GPS, I'd veered significantly off course. Worse, I seemed to be heading deeper into an unmarked section of the swamp rather than toward Devil's Landing. That's when I saw the footprints. They emerged from the water about 20 feet away. Large, barefoot impressions in the mud. Human, but oddly elongated, with what looked like sharp nail marks at the end of each toe. They led away from the water and disappeared into the underbrush. I stared at them, trying to rationalize. A hunter, maybe, who'd lost his boots. But the shape was wrong. Splayed too wide, the arch too high. And who would walk barefoot through a swamp teeming with venomous snakes and sharp cypress knees? The swamp had fallen silent, I realized. No birds, no insects, just the occasional plop of water droplets from leaves. I shouldered my pack and moved quickly in the opposite direction of the footprints. The silence followed me, a presence almost physical in its intensity. Twice I stopped, certain I heard something moving parallel to my path, just out of sight. Each time, the sound ceased the moment I did. Late afternoon brought rain, a gentle shower at first, then a downpour that rendered visibility almost zero. I needed shelter, fast. Through the curtain of rain, I spotted a dark shape ahead, some kind of structure. I slogged toward it, relief washing over me as it took form. An old trapper's cabin, weathered gray boards still mostly intact, a small covered porch offering sanctuary from the deluge. The door hung askew on leather hinges. I called out, not wanting to surprise anyone who might be using it, but my voice was swallowed by the drumming rain. After a moment's hesitation, I stepped inside. The cabin was a single room, perhaps 12 feet square. The remains of a crude stone fireplace occupied one wall. A handmade table and chair sat in the center, and a platform bed stood in the corner, its ancient mattress long since claimed by rodents and insects. The air smelled of damp wood and something else, an animal musk I couldn't quite identify. I dropped my pack and worked quickly to build a fire in the fireplace, grateful to find the chimney unblocked. Soon, a small flame pushed back the gloom, casting dancing shadows across the walls. I hung my soaked outer clothing on a makeshift line and spread my sleeping bag on the cleanest section of floor. The rain showed no signs of stopping. Outside, darkness was falling rapidly. I decided to stay put for the night and attempt to find my way back to marked trails in the morning. I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated pasta on my portable stove and tried to ignore the growing sense that something was wrong. The first sign came when I tried to call up the offline map on my phone. The file was corrupted somehow, the map replaced by a jumble of pixelated nonsense. Then my backup compass began to spin erratically, the needle whirling like it was searching for a north that no longer existed. "Electronic failures happen in dampness," I said aloud, my voice startling in the silence. But the compass wasn't electronic. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows across the cabin walls. One shadow in particular caught my eye, a tall, elongated silhouette that didn't correspond to anything in the room. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the wall, the shadow was gone. That night, the dreams came again. In them, I was walking through an endless swamp, following someone or something, always just ahead, always just out of sight. A voice called my name, sometimes sounding like Sarah, sometimes like my father, sometimes like neither. The protection charm burned against my chest where I'd hung it on a cord. I woke, gasping in the dark, the fire reduced to embers. Rain still pattered on the roof, but another sound caught my attention, a rhythmic scratching from outside, like nails on wood. It moved around the perimeter of the cabin, pausing occasionally before continuing. When it reached the door, it stopped. The latch, nothing more than a wooden peg thrust through a loop, rattled slightly. I lay frozen, unable to breathe. A minute passed, then another. The scratching resumed, moving away from the door and continuing around the cabin. Eventually, it faded entirely. I didn't sleep again that night. Dawn revealed a swamp transformed by the heavy rain. Water levels had risen significantly, turning what had been damp ground into shallow pools. My hopes of retracing my steps faded as I realized the trail I'd followed would now be completely submerged. Outside the cabin, I searched for signs of whatever had circled it during the night. The ground was too wet to hold footprints, but on the rough wooden walls, about 7 feet up, I found them, deep gouges in the wood, like something with claws had dug in as it moved around the structure. My stomach knotted as I touched one of the marks. The exposed wood looked fresh, pale against the weathered gray. I needed to get back to civilization. Without reliable maps or compass, my best option was to follow flowing water downstream, which would eventually lead to the Pearl River and, from there, to roads and people. I packed up and set out, the cabin disappearing quickly behind me as I waded through knee-deep water. The swamp felt different now. Watchful, alive in a way that had nothing to do with its abundant wildlife. The birds had returned after the rain, but their calls seemed muted, cautious. Twice I spotted alligators gliding through the water, their presence less troubling than the nameless dread that had taken root in my chest. Around midday, I found something that stopped me cold. A small island of dry land rose from the swamp, and at its center stood a crude altar of sorts. Stones piled into a rough table surrounded by a circle of animal bones. On the altar lay offerings: feathers, small animal skulls, bundles of herbs, and something that looked disturbingly like human teeth. Hanging from the branches above were dozens of small dolls made from twigs and moss, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions. This was no random arrangement. Someone, or something, had been here recently. The herb bundles were still green, not yet dried. A chill ran through me despite the humid air. I backed away slowly, not wanting to disturb anything. That's when I heard the singing. It came from somewhere ahead of me. A woman's voice, low and melodic, singing words I couldn't understand. Hope flared briefly. Another person meant potential help, directions back to marked trails. But something in that voice triggered a primal warning in my brain. It was beautiful, but wrong somehow, like music played on an instrument with missing strings. Against my better judgment, I moved toward it, pushing through hanging moss and ducking under low branches. The singing grew louder. Through the trees, I glimpsed movement. A figure wading through the water, her back to me. She wore what looked like a simple white dress, now dirty and torn. Her hair hung in long gray tangles down her back. She seemed to be gathering something from the water, bending down occasionally to pluck items I couldn't see. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" The singing stopped. The woman went completely still. Slowly, very slowly, she turned. Her face, dear God, her face. Where features should have been was only smooth, pale skin stretched tight over bone, broken only by a wide slash of a mouth filled with needle-like teeth. That mouth now stretched into a terrible smile. "Lost," she echoed, her voice now a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Yes, you are." I ran. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the undergrowth, no longer caring about direction or stealth. Water splashed loudly with each desperate stride. Behind me came sounds of pursuit. Not the crashing I made, but swift, liquid movements, like something born to the swamp. I ran until my lungs burned, until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. Finally, I collapsed against a cypress trunk, gasping for breath. The swamp had fallen silent again. I strained to hear any sound of pursuit, but there was nothing. Minutes passed. My breathing slowed. Perhaps I'd lost her. Perhaps I'd imagined her entirely. Stress and isolation playing tricks on an exhausted mind. Elijah. The whisper came from directly above me. I looked up. a scream frozen in my throat. She clung to the trunk like an insect, her body bent at impossible angles, that terrible smile now inches from my face. Her skin had taken on a greenish cast, algae-like patches spreading across her cheeks. Her eyes, which I now could see, were milky white, pupilless. "You came to my swamp," she hissed. "You came to forget. But the swamp remembers everything, Elijah Mitchell. The swamp keeps what it claims." My name. She knew my name. I stumbled backward into the water, my hand closing around a fallen branch, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. The thing that looked like a woman tilted her head, studying me with those blind eyes. "Roy sent you with protection," she said, her voice changing, becoming almost conversational. She pointed at the charm still hanging around my neck. "The old ways. He remembers, at least." "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice a hollow croak. "They called me Marie once, when I walked on dry land." She crawled down the trunk, movements jerky and fluid at once. "Now they call me La Sorcière du Marais, the Swamp Witch. Some say I drowned here in 1922. Some say I was born from the water itself." She grinned again, those needle teeth gleaming. "Does it matter what is true when the ending is the same?" She moved closer, the water rippling around her waist. I raised the branch, but she only laughed, a sound like water rushing over stones. "Your father's knife would serve you better," she said. "Iron and steel, older than this flesh I wear." My free hand went to the knife at my belt. How did she know it was my father's? "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Want?" She seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "The swamp doesn't want, Elijah. It takes, it claims, it keeps." She gestured at the water around us. "Do you know how many lie beneath us? How many wandered too far from marked paths? Their bones feed the cypress now, their memories swirl in the current." With each word, she drew closer. The protection charm felt warm against my chest. "But you," she continued, "you came willingly into the depths, running from memories that hurt, seeking the embrace of emptiness." Her head tilted again. "The swamp understands this desire. I understand." She lunged suddenly, inhumanly fast. I swung the branch, connecting with her shoulder, but it passed through as if she were made of mist. Her hands, now elongated, fingers tipped with curved black claws, wrapped around my throat. "Give yourself to the swamp, Elijah," she whispered, her breath smelling of stagnant water and decay. "Let it take away your pain. Let it unmake you and remake you. You can be free here, forever." Cold spread from her touch, numbing my skin, seeping into my veins. The world began to darken at the edges. In desperation, I grabbed the protection charm and pressed it against her chest. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Her flesh sizzled where the charm touched it, emitting a high-pitched keening sound that no human throat could make. She released me, falling back into the water with a splash. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran again, splashing through the swamp, the knife now in one hand, the charm clutched tightly in the other. Behind me, that inhuman wailing continued, then shifted into words I didn't understand, a chant or curse that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The swamp itself seemed to respond to her voice. Roots rose from the water to snag my feet. Branches bent unnaturally, blocking my path. The water grew thicker, more resistant, as if trying to hold me in place. I crashed through it all, powered by blind terror. My feet found higher ground and I scrambled up onto a raised bank. Through a break in the trees ahead, I saw something that made my heart leap. A wooden observation platform, the kind built for tourists. A sign of civilization, of paths that led back to the world. I ran toward it, hope surging. 20 feet, 10 feet, almost there. Something wrapped around my ankle. Not a root or vine, but a hand, pale and bloated, reaching up from beneath the water. I fell hard, my face slamming into the muddy ground. More hands emerged, gripping my legs, my arms, pulling me back toward deeper water. Their faces broke the surface. The drowned, dozens of them. Men, women, their features blurred by water and time, eye sockets empty, mouths frozen in eternal screams. They pulled with surprising strength, dragging me inch by inch. Marie appeared behind them, gliding across the water's surface. "They want company, Elijah," she said softly. "The swamp gets lonely." In desperation, I slashed at the hands with my father's knife. Where the blade touched, the hands dissolved into murky water. I cut myself free and lunged for the platform, hauling myself up onto its weathered boards. Looking back, I saw Marie watching me, those milky eyes somehow focused on my face. Behind her, the drowned had disappeared beneath the surface again. "You can run to your world of concrete and noise," she called. "But the swamp is patient, Elijah Mitchell, and now it knows your name. It knows your scent. It knows your fears." She smiled that terrible smile. "When the emptiness becomes too much to bear, you'll return, and we'll be waiting." She sank slowly beneath the water, leaving only ripples to mark where she had been. I didn't move for a long time, certain this was some trick, that the moment I lowered my guard, those pale hands would reach for me again. But nothing happened. Eventually, I found the courage to follow the boardwalk, which led to a more substantial trail, and finally to a ranger station. The ranger on duty, a young woman named Cassie, looked alarmed when I stumbled in, muddy, bleeding from countless scratches, eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. She called for medical assistance and wrapped me in a blanket while we waited. "You were in Honey Island for 3 days?" she asked, handing me a cup of coffee that I couldn't hold steady. "Where exactly?" I tried to describe my route, the cabin, the altar I'd found. Her expression grew increasingly concerned. "That section's been closed off for years," she said. "There's no cabin recorded in that area. Are you sure about what you saw?" Before I could answer, the medical team arrived. As they loaded me into the ambulance, Cassie pressed something into my hand, a pamphlet about wilderness safety, but tucked inside was a small piece of paper with her number and 5 words that made my blood freeze. "I believe what you saw." At the hospital, they treated me for exposure, dehydration, and minor injuries. The doctors suggested my more extreme experiences were hallucinations brought on by a combination of stress, isolation, and possible contact with toxic plants or fungi in the swamp. I almost believed them. Almost. 2 things prevent me from accepting their rational explanation. First, the protection charm Roy gave me was gone. Not lost during my flight through the swamp, but transformed into a blackened, twisted thing that crumbled to dust when I touched it. Second, sometimes when I sleep, I dream of the swamp, of Marie, of the drowned ones who wait beneath dark waters. In these dreams, she whispers to me, telling me the swamp misses me, that it has a place prepared just for me. I've moved away from Louisiana now, found an apartment in Albuquerque, about as far from swampland as I can get. But distance doesn't seem to matter. Last week, I found a small puddle of water on my kitchen floor. When I bent to wipe it up, I caught a whiff of that distinctive swamp smell, cypress and decay and something else, something old. And beside the puddle, pressed into the linoleum as if by bare feet, a single, elongated footprint with sharp nail marks at the end of each toe. "The swamp is patient," Marie said, "and now it knows my name." My name is Elijah Mercer, and I am 34 years old. This happened in August 2024. The oppressive Louisiana heat clung to my skin like a second layer as I hiked deeper into Kisatchie National Forest. My German shepherd, Duke, trotted ahead, his nose working overtime on the earthy scents of the wilderness. We had left civilization behind 3 days ago, trading the noise of New Orleans for the quiet solitude of the Longleaf Vista area, a remote section of the forest where the pine trees stretched endlessly toward the sky. I needed this escape. After my wife, Melissa's death 6 months ago, the walls of our home had become a prison of memories. Every corner held her ghost. The kitchen where she hummed while cooking, the living room where we curled up watching old movies, the bedroom where I still reached for her in my sleep. The grief counselor suggested finding a new normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. So here I was, testing the theory that nature could heal what therapy couldn't. "Duke, stay close," I called as he disappeared around a bend in the trail. The air was thick with humidity, making each breath feel like drinking warm water. Sweat trickled down my back as I adjusted my pack and followed after him. The trail had become less defined over the past mile, barely visible beneath a carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. My GPS showed we were approaching Bayou Cypremort, a waterway known to locals but rarely visited by tourists. According to my research, there was an abandoned trapper's cabin nearby where we could rest before heading deeper into the backcountry tomorrow. Duke's sharp bark pulled me from my thoughts. He stood rigid at the edge of a small clearing, hackles raised. "What is it, boy?" I quickened my pace to reach him, scanning the area for whatever had triggered his alarm. The clearing was unremarkable, just a patch of ground where the canopy opened slightly to allow sunlight through. But Duke wouldn't budge, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "There's nothing there," I said, more to reassure myself than him. I tugged gently on his leash. "Come on." He growled low in his throat but finally relented, staying unusually close to my side as we moved on. By late afternoon, we reached the cabin, a weather-beaten structure that leaned slightly to one side. The wood had turned silver with age, and vines crept up one wall. It wasn't much, but it would shelter us for the night. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The interior was simple. One room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against the far wall. Someone had been here relatively recently. There was a stack of dry firewood next to the hearth and minimal dust on the surfaces. "Home sweet home," I murmured, dropping my pack and surveying our accommodations. Duke sniffed every corner but seemed more relaxed than he had been on the trail. I spent the remaining daylight gathering more wood and filtering water from a nearby stream. As the sun set, I lit a fire in the hearth, its warm glow creating dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Outside, the forest came alive with night sounds, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. Duke and I shared a dinner of freeze-dried beef stew, which he seemed to enjoy more than I did. As darkness settled completely, I pulled out Melissa's journal, the one she kept during our first years together. I'd brought it as both comfort and torture, a way to keep her close while forcing myself to confront her absence. "Remember our trip to Colorado, Duke?" I scratched behind his ears as he lay beside me. Melissa was afraid of heights, but she still hiked that ridge with us. Duke's tail thumped against the floor at the sound of her name. He missed her too. I read a few entries by flashlight, Melissa's handwriting flowing across the pages in elegant curves, so different from my own chicken scratch. Her words were filled with hope and plans for our future, a future that had been severed by a drunk driver on a rainy February night. The fire had burned down to embers when I finally closed the journal and prepared for sleep. Duke took his customary position at the foot of the cot, his warm weight a comforting presence. "Good night, boy," I whispered, letting exhaustion pull me under. I woke suddenly, heart pounding, unsure what had disturbed my sleep. The fire had died completely, leaving the cabin in darkness except for silver moonlight filtering through the single window. Duke was sitting up, staring at the door, a low whine building in his throat. "What's wrong?" I whispered, reaching for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing out of place. But Duke's behavior was concerning. He rarely reacted this way unless there was something to react to. Then I heard it, a soft scratching at the door, like fingernails gently testing the wood. I froze, listening intently. It could be an animal, a raccoon or possum exploring the cabin. The alternative was too unsettling to consider out here in the wilderness. The scratching stopped, replaced by silence so complete it seemed to press against my ears. Duke's whine had ceased, but he remained tense, gaze locked on the door. Minutes passed. I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it when the sound came again. Not at the door this time, but at the window. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding thin in the darkness. No response. Just another series of scratches, more insistent now. I swung my legs off the cot and stood, keeping the flashlight trained on the window. Through the grimy glass, I could see nothing but the dark outlines of trees swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel inside the cabin. Duke growled, and I placed a calming hand on his head, though my own pulse raced. "It's probably an animal," I said aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even my own. A sudden thump against the side of the cabin made me jump. Then another, like someone, or something, testing the structure's strength. "Hey!" I shouted, fear giving way to anger. If this was a person messing with me, I wanted them to know I wasn't intimidated. The thumping stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. I waited, muscles tense, for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Nothing. No more scratches, no more thumps. Gradually, the normal nighttime sounds of the forest returned. Crickets chirping. The distant hoot of an owl. Duke eventually settled back down, though he remained more alert than usual. I lay back on the cot but didn't sleep, watching the moonlight slowly shift across the cabin floor as the night aged. Morning arrived with a chorus of birdsong and dappled sunlight. The events of the night seemed less threatening in daylight, probably just forest creatures or the wind playing tricks. I stepped outside, stretching my stiff muscles. The air was already warm and heavy with moisture, promising another sweltering day. Duke bounded into the clearing, apparently having forgotten his nighttime concerns. That's when I saw them. Long, vertical scratches on the wooden door, fresh enough that small splinters still clung to the edges. I ran my fingers over them, 4 parallel lines that couldn't have been made by any common forest animal. A chill ran down my spine despite the heat. These weren't here yesterday. "Duke, come," I called, suddenly eager to continue our journey and leave this cabin behind. We set out after a quick breakfast, heading deeper into the forest. My map showed an interesting route that would take us by an area locally known as Cypress Knee Hollow, where unusually shaped tree formations created an otherworldly landscape. The trail became increasingly difficult to follow. In some places, it disappeared entirely, forcing me to rely on my GPS and compass. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding together as if huddling in conversation, their branches creating a canopy that blocked much of the sunlight. Despite the shade, sweat soaked my shirt by midday. The humidity made the air feel like soup, and each breath required effort. Duke panted heavily beside me, his usual enthusiasm dampened by the heat. "Let's take a break, buddy," I said, finding a fallen log that offered a makeshift seat. I pulled out my water bottle and a collapsible bowl for Duke, pouring him a generous amount before taking a long drink myself. The water was already warm, but it helped. I checked my GPS. We were on track, about 4 miles from our intended campsite for the night. As I repacked my water bottle, Duke's head snapped up, ears forward, body tense. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it?" I asked quietly, scanning our surroundings. The forest seemed still. Nothing moving except the occasional flicker of leaves and a subtle breeze. But Duke's reaction told me something was there, just beyond my perception. Then I heard it, a snapping twig, too deliberate to be caused by wind. Then another, closer. Someone or something was approaching. I stood slowly, hand dropping to the hunting knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone there?" More movement in the underbrush, circling around to my left. Duke's growl deepened, his body coiled to spring. "Show yourself," I demanded, fear and adrenaline sharpening my senses. A figure stepped out from behind a massive cypress tree about 20 yards away. A man, tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes that hung from his frame. His face was partially hidden by a wild, unkempt beard, but I could see his eyes, dark and unblinking as they fixed on me. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice rough as if rarely used. I swallowed hard. I didn't realize. This is national forest land, public property. The man took a step closer. Duke's growl intensified, and I put a restraining hand on his collar. "Those maps don't mark everything they should," the man said. "Some places aren't meant for visitors." "We're just passing through," I explained, trying to assess whether he posed a real threat. He carried no visible weapon, but there was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he seemed to blend with the shadows even in daylight. "We'll be gone by tomorrow." He cocked his head slightly, studying me with those unnervingly steady eyes. "You stayed in the Cypermort cabin." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Just for the night. A thin smile spread across his face, revealing yellowed teeth. "Heard you shouting. Night visitors bothering you?" My blood ran cold. Had he been watching us? Was he responsible for the scratches, the noises? "Just some animal," I said carefully. "Nothing to worry about." He chuckled, a dry sound like dead leaves rustling. "No animals make those marks, stranger. Those are from the rugaroo." "The what?" "Rugaroo. Some call it a swamp werewolf. Others say it's a man cursed to transform for breaking Lent 7 years running." He took another step closer. Duke tensed beside me. Been hunting these woods for generations. Hungry for human flesh. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Clearly, this was some local trying to scare the outsider with folk tales. "Right. Well, thanks for the warning. Like I said, we're just passing through." The man's smile faded. "You think I'm spinning yarns? Ask your dog what he sensed last night." He gestured toward Duke, who hadn't relaxed his defensive posture. "Animals know. They always know when it's near." A flash of doubt crept into my mind as I remembered Duke's behavior, his fixation on the clearing, his alertness at the cabin. But I quickly dismissed it. This was exactly the reaction the man wanted. "We should get going," I said firmly, gathering my pack. "Daylight to burn." The man made no move to stop us as I guided Duke back to what passed for a trail. But as we started to walk away, he called after me. "When night falls, listen for the whispers. If you hear your name, don't answer. Never answer." I didn't look back, just increased my pace, putting distance between us and the strange encounter. Duke stayed close to my side, occasionally glancing behind as if expecting pursuit. "Crazy old hermit," I muttered once we were well away, trying to scare us with boogeyman stories. But despite my dismissive words, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The scratches on the cabin door had been real, and Duke's behavior wasn't something I could easily explain away. We hiked for another 3 hours, the forest growing increasingly wild and untamed. Vines draped from trees like frozen green waterfalls. The ground became softer, wetter as we approached the edge of a bayou system that fingered through this part of the forest. According to my map, our campsite should be on slightly higher ground near the water, a small rise that would stay dry even if water levels fluctuated. As the afternoon light began to fade, I spotted the area and felt a surge of relief. The sight was better than I'd expected. A flat clearing ringed by ancient cypress trees, their massive trunks providing a natural windbreak. A crude fire ring of stones suggested others had used this spot before. I set up our camp with practiced efficiency, securing the tent and gathering firewood before darkness fell completely. Duke seemed calmer here, exploring the perimeter but returning frequently to check on me. With the tent ready and a small fire crackling, I prepared our dinner, pasta with dehydrated vegetables and tuna. As we ate, I tried to focus on the peaceful aspects of our surroundings. The gentle lapping of water against the shore, The symphony of frogs and insects, the first stars appearing overhead through breaks in the canopy. But my mind kept returning to the encounter with the strange man and his warning about the rugaroo. I'd heard of this legend before, a staple of Cajun folklore, but had dismissed it as a story told to frighten children into behaving. Now, in the growing darkness of an unfamiliar forest, such dismissals seemed less certain. "We're fine," I told Duke, who looked up at me with trusting eyes. "Just stories to scare tourists." After cleaning up our dinner, I settled by the fire with Melissa's journal again. Tonight, I turned to entries from our early dating days, awkward movie nights and coffee shop meetings, the gradual unfolding of love that neither of us had expected when we first met at a mutual friend's birthday party. "She thought I was arrogant," I told Duke, laughing softly at the memory. "Called me that pretentious photographer guy to her friends for weeks before she agreed to a real date." Duke's ears perked up suddenly, his head turning toward the dark line of trees beyond our firelight. "What is it?" I asked, immediately alert. He rose to his feet, staring intently into the darkness, but didn't growl. It was more like he was listening, head tilted slightly to one side. I strained my ears but heard nothing unusual, just the normal night sounds of the forest. After a minute, Duke relaxed again, lying down by the fire with a heavy sigh. "You're making me jumpy," I told him, closing the journal and storing it safely in my pack. The fire had burned low when I finally crawled into the tent, Duke settling onto his designated sleeping pad next to my sleeping bag. I left the rain fly off the top of the tent, allowing us to see the stars through the mesh ceiling. The night was clear, the air finally cooling after the day's heat. Sleep came easier than I expected, dreamless and deep. I woke to Duke's warm tongue on my face and morning light filtering through the tent mesh. For a moment, I felt almost normal, the crushing weight of grief temporarily lifted by the simplicity of waking in the wilderness with my dog. "Morning, buddy," I croaked, reaching up to ruffle his fur. Something sticky coated his neck. I pulled my hand back to find it smeared with dark red. "Duke!" I sat bolt upright, fully awake now. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I examined him frantically, hands searching for wounds but found none. The blood, and it was definitely blood, wasn't his, yet it matted the fur around his neck and muzzle. "Where did this come from?" I whispered, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. Duke seemed unperturbed, wagging his tail as if nothing was wrong. I unzipped the tent with shaking hands and stepped outside. The morning was bright and clear, the campsite peaceful. No signs of disturbance, no explanation for the blood on my dog. I led Duke to the edge of the bayou and used water to clean him as best I could, the red stains dissolving into the dark water. "Did you catch something in the night?" I asked him, though I knew it was unlikely. Duke was leashed inside the tent with me all night, and the amount of blood suggested something larger than a mouse or small bird. As I finished washing him, my eye caught something at the water's edge, a partial footprint in the mud, larger than my own. I crouched to examine it. The impression was deep, suggesting considerable weight, with what looked like elongated toe marks at the front. Not human, not entirely, but not any animal track I recognized either. My hands trembled slightly as I stood, scanning the shoreline for more prints. There were none visible, just the single impression as if whatever made it had stepped out of the water onto land and then… what? Vanished? I returned to our campsite and quickly broke down the tent, packing with an urgency I hadn't planned for this morning. We needed to move. The rational part of my brain argued that there was probably a logical explanation, a wounded animal that Duke had found, unusual tracks from some local wildlife, but a deeper instinct urged me to leave this place. We hit the trail within 30 minutes, heading southeast according to my original route plan. The path took us deeper into bayou country, where the ground grew increasingly soggy and cypress knees. Woody projections from the tree roots jutted from the saturated soil like the tips of buried spears. The morning's discovery had left me hyper-aware of our surroundings. Every snapping twig, every flutter of birds startled from their perches made me flinch. Duke seemed to share my unease, staying unusually close and alert. By midday, we reached a section where the trail disappeared entirely beneath murky water, a flooded portion that my map hadn't indicated. I checked my GPS to confirm we were on the right path. According to the device, the trail continued straight through what was now a shallow extension of the bayou. "Guess we're getting wet," I told Duke, who looked at the water with clear skepticism. The flooded section appeared to be about 50 yards across, the water varying from ankle to knee-deep judging by the visible portions of submerged vegetation. Not dangerous if we were careful, but definitely unpleasant. I took off my boots and socks, storing them in my pack to keep them dry, and rolled up my pants. Duke watched these preparations with increasing anxiety, whining softly. "Come on, boy, we've crossed water before." I stepped into the bayou, mud squishing between my toes as I tested the bottom. It was firm enough to walk on, though each step released bubbles of swamp gas that popped with tiny bursts of foul odor. Duke followed reluctantly, the water reaching halfway up his legs. We moved slowly, testing each step before committing our weight. The midday sun beat down on us, its reflection on the water's surface nearly blinding. Halfway across, I noticed the silence. The constant background chorus of birds and insects had ceased, leaving only the soft splash of our movements through the water. Even the air felt different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. "Almost there," I encouraged Duke, though I was talking more to calm myself. 3/4 of the way across, Duke stopped abruptly, his body rigid. Before I could question him, I felt it, something solid brushing against my calf beneath the water. I froze, heart pounding. Probably just a submerged branch or root. I told myself this even as I knew it had moved against the current with purpose. "Keep going," I whispered to Duke, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Just a little further." Another touch, firmer this time, wrapping partially around my ankle before sliding away. Not a branch. Nothing that grew in nature moved like that. Panic surged through me. I abandoned caution and lurched forward, splashing loudly as I half ran, half waded toward the shoreline. Duke followed, matching my urgency. Something grabbed my right foot, halting my progress with terrifying strength. I pitched forward, barely catching myself with my hands before my face hit the water. Duke barked frantically, spinning around in the water beside me. The grip tightened, pulling downward. I kicked desperately with my free leg, connecting with something solid yet yielding beneath the surface. The pressure released suddenly, and I scrambled forward again, adrenaline overwhelming all other sensations. We reached the shore in a frenzied rush, clambering onto relatively dry ground before turning to look back. The water's surface was disturbed by our passage, but otherwise revealed nothing of what lay beneath. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, sitting heavily on a fallen log to examine my ankle. 4 distinct marks encircled it. Not quite bruises yet, but the skin was reddened in a pattern that unavoidably suggested fingers. Long, thin fingers with too many joints. Duke pressed against my leg, still watching the water warily. I stroked his wet fur with a trembling hand while trying to process what had just happened. Could it have been an alligator? No, the grip had been too deliberate, too hand-like. A large, snapping turtle? Possible, but unlikely to grab and release like that. The hermit's words echoed in my mind. Been hunting these woods for generations, hungry for human flesh. "Stop it," I said aloud, shoving the thought away. There's a rational explanation. But sitting there staring at the marks on my ankle, rational explanations felt increasingly inadequate. I pulled my socks and boots back on and checked my GPS. We were still on track but had covered less distance than planned due to the morning's hasty departure and now this delay. At this rate, we wouldn't reach our next planned campsite before dark. The smart move would be to find somewhere closer to stop for the night. but that would mean another night in this area, which suddenly seemed like a terrible idea. "We're pushing on," I told Duke, standing with renewed determination. "Extra miles today means we're out of here tomorrow." The afternoon blurred into a grueling march. The terrain grew more challenging, muddy stretches that sucked at our boots, dense undergrowth that required careful navigation, fallen trees that forced detours. The temperature remained high and the humidity made each breath a conscious effort. Duke and I stopped frequently for water breaks, both of us showing signs of fatigue. But beneath the physical exhaustion was a deeper unease that kept us moving forward. Something felt wrong about these woods, like we were unwelcome intruders being watched from all sides. Several times, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, only to find nothing when I turned to look. Once, I was certain I heard my name called softly from a thicket of palmettos. Elijah. But when I called back, only silence answered. The hermit's warning flashed again. If you hear your name, don't answer. Never answer. By late afternoon, we had pushed well beyond my original daily distance plan. According to my GPS, we were now only about 5 miles from where the forest opened up to more traveled areas, practically civilization compared to where we'd been. "Just a bit further," I encouraged Duke, who plodded beside me with drooping ears and tail. The light was fading fast, the forest canopy accelerating twilight's arrival. I needed to make a decision soon, press on in darkness or make camp for one more night. Safety considerations won out over my growing paranoia. Night hiking in unfamiliar territory invited twisted ankles or worse, especially in terrain as treacherous as this. We needed to stop. I found a small clearing that seemed defensible. Higher ground with good visibility and few approaches. No comfortable fire ring or signs of previous use, but it would do. Setting up camp quickly, I opted for a cold dinner of protein bars and jerky rather than using the camp stove. Something about adding smells to the night air seemed unwise. Duke didn't complain about the unexciting meal, devouring his portion and watching hopefully for more. Dusk settled around us, bringing the now familiar chorus of night creatures. I set up the tent but wasn't ready to confine myself inside just yet. Instead, I sat on a fallen log, flashlight ready, watching the deepening shadows with Duke pressed against my side. "One more night," I whispered to him. "Then we're out of here." The darkness grew more complete, the only light coming from my small flashlight and the stars visible through occasional breaks in the canopy. The forest sounds shifted, deeper and more primal as nocturnal creatures awakened. My eyes grew heavy despite my anxiety. We had pushed hard today, covering nearly twice my planned distance, and exhaustion was claiming its due. I fought it, pinching my arm and shifting positions to stay alert. Duke's head snapped up suddenly, ears forward, body tense. I followed his gaze into the darkness beyond our small clearing but saw nothing. "What is it?" "Boy," I whispered, hand automatically moving to the hunting knife at my belt. A series of soft, popping sounds came from the forest to our right, like footsteps on dry leaves, but oddly arrhythmic. They moved in a semicircle around our position, never coming closer but never moving away. Duke growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating against my leg where he pressed close. I strained my eyes but could make out nothing in the wall of darkness surrounding us. The stepping sound stopped directly across the clearing from where we sat. I aimed my flashlight in that direction but saw only trees and underbrush. Nothing moved, yet I could feel a presence, something watching, evaluating. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding thin and vulnerable. No response, just the weight of unseen eyes. I stood slowly, Duke rising with me. "We know you're there," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Show yourself." Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then, so softly I almost missed it, my name. Elijah. The voice wasn't quite human, too hollow as if spoken through water. It came from the darkness ahead where I had pointed the flashlight and seen nothing. "Who's there?" I demanded, fear and anger warring in my chest. "Elijah," it came again, slightly louder. Then, impossibly, in Melissa's voice, "Elijah, I'm cold." Ice shot through my veins. Duke barked sharply, lunging forward before I grabbed his collar. "That's not funny," I shouted, rage momentarily overwhelming fear. "Who are you? Show yourself." A rustling from the same direction. Then, a figure stepped into the dim edge of my flashlight beam. A woman's silhouette, slight and familiar in a way that made my heart stutter. Melissa? The name escaped me before reason could intervene. The figure took another step forward. In the improved light, I could see it was indeed a woman, with Melissa's height and build, her dark hair falling past her shoulders. But as she moved fully into the flashlight's glow, the resemblance fractured. Her face was wrong, features similar to Melissa's, but as if someone had tried to recreate her from an imperfect memory. The eyes were too large, the smile too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous and sharp, and her movements were jerky, marionette-like. "Elijah," she said again in that perfect imitation of Melissa's voice. "I've missed you." Duke's barking became frenzied. He strained against my grip, hackles raised, all his instincts screaming danger. "You're not her," I managed, backing up a step. "What are you?" The thing wearing Melissa's approximate form cocked its head unnaturally far to one side. "Don't you want to be with me again? Don't you miss me?" "Stop it," I said, my voice breaking. "Stop using her voice." The creature's smile widened impossibly further, splitting its face almost ear to ear. "But I came back for you. I came back wrong, but I came back." It took another step toward us. Duke's barking reached a new pitch of desperation. I fumbled in my pocket for the bear spray I carried, never taking my eyes off the thing that wasn't Melissa. "Stay back," I warned, raising the canister. It paused, head still tilted at that impossible angle. "The dog has to go first," it said conversationally, still in Melissa's voice. "Dogs always know. They see what we are." At that moment, Duke broke free from my grip, launching himself toward the creature with a ferocity I'd never witnessed in him before. I screamed his name, but it was too late. He was airborne, jaws aimed at the thing's throat. What happened next burned itself into my memory, a nightmare played at half speed. The creature moved with blinding speed, one arm elongating grotesquely to catch Duke in midair. Its fingers, now too long, too jointed, wrapped around his throat while its other hand, similarly transformed, plunged into his flank. Duke's yelp of pain galvanized me. I charged forward, bear spray forgotten as I drew my hunting knife. The creature looked up, its face now barely recognizable as humanoid, features shifting like wax near flame. "You shouldn't have said my name," it hissed, Melissa's voice now distorted with something ancient and hungry beneath it. I slashed wildly with the knife, connecting with the arm holding Duke. A screech that belonged in no human throat tore through the night as the creature released my dog. Dark liquid that didn't look like blood splashed from the wound. Duke hit the ground and scrambled to his feet, wounded but mobile. The creature's attention fixed on me now, its body contorting in ways that defied anatomy, limbs bending at new joints, torso elongating. It no longer bothered maintaining Melissa's appearance, the face now a nightmare of shadowy features rearranging themselves like smoke. I backed away, knife raised, mind racing for a way out of this impossible situation. Duke limped to my side, still growling despite his injury. "Run," I told him, knowing he wouldn't but needing to try. The creature chittered, a sound like fingernails on glass, and crouched as if to spring. I braced myself, knowing the knife would likely do little against whatever this thing was. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the night, echoing among the trees. The creature jerked, a new hole appearing in what approximated its shoulder. It screeched again, head swiveling toward the source of the shot. Another crack, another impact. The creature backed away, its form becoming less distinct, more shadow than substance. "Iron hurts them," called a familiar raspy voice. "Always has." The hermit stepped into the clearing, an ancient hunting rifle raised to his shoulder for another shot. The creature hissed, retreating further into the darkness. "Told you about answering to your name," the old man said, not taking his eyes off the shadows where the thing had disappeared, especially when it comes wearing a dead loved one's face. My knees felt suddenly weak, and I sank to the ground beside Duke, examining his wound. The gash in his side was deep but had missed anything vital. His breathing was labored but steady. What was that thing?" I managed to ask. The hermit lowered his rifle slightly. "Told you, rugaroo, but not the kind from the storybooks." He spat on the ground. "Something older. Been in these parts since before people. Takes forms from your mind, uses them to hunt." "It looked like my wife," I said, the horror of it still fresh. "It used her voice." He nodded grimly. "They dig through your thoughts when you sleep. Find what you want most, what you fear most. Use it against you." He gestured toward Duke. "Animals sense them for what they are. That's why it wanted to kill your dog first." As if understanding, Duke whined softly, pressing against my leg despite his pain. I tore strips from a spare shirt in my pack and bandaged his wound as best I could. "Why did you help us?" I asked the hermit, the initial shock giving way to practical questions. He shrugged. "Been hunting that thing for 30 years. Took my brother back in '94. Comes and goes, but always returns when it's hungry." The old man's eyes were hard in the flashlight's beam. "Never managed to kill it, just drive it off. Iron hurts it, but doesn't end it." "Will it come back tonight?" "Not likely. 2 iron rounds in it, it'll need time to heal. But we shouldn't linger." He gestured to my camp. "Pack up. My place isn't far, safer than out here." Under normal circumstances, following a strange hermit deeper into the woods would seem like madness. But after what I'd just witnessed, the old man represented my best chance at survival. "Give me 5 minutes," I said, rising to break down the tent. The hermit kept watch, rifle ready as I packed with frantic efficiency. Duke stayed close, favoring his injured side but alert. Within minutes, we were ready to move. "This way," the hermit said, leading us along a barely visible path I would never have noticed on my own. "Stay close and stay quiet. It may be wounded, but others might be drawn by the commotion." Others. The word sent a fresh chill through me. We hiked in tense silence for about 20 minutes, moving deeper into the forest, but with purpose. The hermit navigated without hesitation, occasionally pausing to listen before continuing. Finally, we emerged into a small clearing dominated by a sturdy cabin built on stilts, a common design in areas prone to flooding. Light glowed from within, warm and incongruously welcoming in this place of nightmares. "Home," the hermit said simply, heading toward a set of wooden steps that led to the cabin's entrance. I followed cautiously, supporting Duke as he climbed the stairs. The hermit opened the door and gestured us inside. The cabin's interior was surprisingly well kept. One large room with a wood stove, a rough wooden table with chairs, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies, and a bed in the corner. The walls were hung with an eclectic collection of items: animal skins, dried herbs, bundles of what looked like feathers and bones tied with twine, and, most notably, an impressive array of weaponry: rifles, shotguns, and knives of various sizes. "Sit," the hermit instructed, pointing to the table. "Need to look at your dog's wound proper." I helped Duke onto one of the chairs, murmuring reassurances as the hermit gathered supplies from a cabinet. My mind was still reeling from the encounter, trying to process what I'd seen. "What's your name?" I asked as the hermit returned with a first aid kit and what looked like homemade poultices. "Martin Thibodeau," he replied, kneeling beside Duke to examine the gash in his flank. "Been out here 32 years. "Elijah Mercer," I said, then added unnecessarily, "New Orleans." Martin nodded, gently cleaning Duke's wound with a solution that smelled of alcohol and herbs. Duke whined but held still, seeming to understand this man was helping. "Wound's clean," Martin said after a thorough examination. Deep, but missed anything vital. Dog's lucky. He applied a dark, paste-like substance to the gash. This'll help with healing, keep infection away. Thank you, I said, watching as he wrapped Duke's torso with clean bandages. For everything. We wouldn't have survived without you. Martin shrugged off the gratitude. Bad luck running into that thing. Been quiet for months. Thought maybe it had moved on. He secured the bandage and straightened. You mentioned a wife, the one it imitated? The reference to Melissa sent a fresh pang through me. She died 6 months ago. Car accident. Martin's weathered face showed a flicker of sympathy. Grief makes you vulnerable to them. They smell it like sharks smell blood. He moved to the wood stove, adding a log to the fire and putting a kettle on to heat. Hungry? Got stew. I was surprised to realize I was starving despite everything. Yes, please, and water for Duke. As Martin prepared simple bowls of venison stew and set out water for Duke, I found myself studying him more carefully. He moved with purpose, each action precise and practiced. Despite his wild appearance in isolation, there was nothing deranged about him. If anything, he seemed hyper-rational, a man who had adapted perfectly to his unusual circumstances. How long have you been hunting that thing? I asked as he placed a steaming bowl before me. Since it took my brother, he replied, sitting across from me with his own bowl. Raymond and I came out here hunting. Both saw it, but it wore our mother's face. She died the year before. Ray answered when it called his name. Martin's face hardened at the memory. I found pieces of him 5 days later. I swallowed hard. Appetite suddenly diminished. I'm sorry. Local authorities called it a bear attack, he continued, taking a spoonful of stew. Easier that way, but I knew. Stayed out here ever since, learning its patterns, how to fight it. You said iron hurts it? Martin nodded. Pure iron, not steel. Old lore gets that right at least. Salt, too, and certain herbs. He gestured to bundles hanging from the ceiling. Set up protections around this place. Keeps it away, mostly. Mostly? I echoed, unease creeping back. Nothing's perfect against them. They're old. Older than people. Older than most things living. He studied me across the table. Tomorrow, I'll guide you out of here. Back to the main trails where it's safer. For tonight, we stay put. I nodded gratefully, the thought of navigating the dark forest again unthinkable. We ate in companionable silence for a while, the stew warming me from the inside. Duke finished his water and laid his head on my leg, eyes drooping with exhaustion. You can take the bed, Martin offered as we finished our meal. I'll keep watch. I couldn't. You've had a harder day, he cut me off. Need rest if we're hiking out tomorrow. I'm used to broken sleep. Too tired to argue further, I thanked him and moved to the bed, Duke limping along beside me. The mattress was thin but comfortable after the day's exertions. I removed my boots, but otherwise remained fully dressed, ready to move if necessary. Duke settled on the floor beside the bed, his breathing already evening into sleep despite his injury. I envied his ability to find rest so easily. Martin, I said, a thought occurring as I lay down. That thing. It knew about Melissa. How? The hermit was cleaning his rifle by the stove, methodical movements in the warm light. Told you. They get in your head while you sleep. Read your thoughts, your memories. Found her there. The violation of it, having my precious memories of Melissa rifled through by that creature, brought a surge of anger that momentarily overwhelmed my fear. How many are there? I asked. Martin paused in his work. Don't know for certain. At least 3 in these parts. Maybe more. He reassembled the rifle with practiced hands. They're territorial. Don't often hunt together. Small mercy. With that chilling thought, I closed my eyes, certain sleep would elude me. But exhaustion had its way, and I drifted off to the sounds of Martin moving quietly around the cabin, the steady rhythm of Duke's breathing beside me, and the occasional pop from the wood stove. I dreamed of Melissa, but not as she had been in life. In the dream, she stood at the edge of a dark bayou, her body elongating unnaturally as she reached for me, her smile splitting her face. I tried to run but couldn't move, my feet sinking into the mud as she came closer, closer. "Wake up!" Martin's voice pulled me from the nightmare. I sat up, gasping, sweat-soaked despite the cool morning air. Duke was already awake, watching me with concern. "Bad dreams are normal after encountering them," Martin said, placing a mug of coffee in my hands. "They leave an impression." I sipped the strong, bitter liquid gratefully. "What time is it?" "Dawn," he replied, moving to the window. "Best time to travel. They're weakest in daylight." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, wincing at various aches and pains from yesterday's ordeal. Duke seemed improved, though, moving with more ease despite his bandaged side. "How's he doing?" I asked as Martin checked the dog's wound. "Healing well. Your dog's tough." He rewrapped the bandage after applying more of his homemade remedy. "Keep it clean when you get home. Change dressing daily. Should heal fine." After a breakfast of cornbread and more coffee, we prepared to leave. Martin packed a small bag with provisions and ammunition, strapping a holster with a large hunting knife to his belt and slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Take this," he said, handing me an old revolver. "Iron bullets. Won't kill them, but might buy you time if needed." The weight of the gun was unfamiliar and somehow reassuring. I hope we won't need it. So do I. Martin checked the cabin one last time before leading us outside into the misty morning. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing, but no less alien. Martin set a brisk pace along trails that weren't marked on any map, occasionally stopping to listen or examine signs I couldn't perceive. Duke stayed close to my side, his injury slowing him but not dampening his alertness. "How far to the main trail?" I asked after we'd been hiking for about an hour. 4 miles, Martin replied, "but we're taking a longer route, 7 miles total, safer." I didn't question his judgment. The man had survived in these woods for decades, hunting creatures most people didn't believe existed. If he said a route was safer, I believed him. We walked in silence for the most part, conserving energy and staying vigilant. Occasionally, Martin would point out a plant or track, offering brief explanations, medicinal uses, signs of normal wildlife versus other things. I absorbed it all, partly out of genuine interest and partly to keep my mind occupied with something besides fear. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and raising the temperature. Humidity wrapped around us like a damp blanket, making each breath an effort. Duke panted heavily but kept pace, stopping gratefully whenever we paused for water. Around midday, Martin froze mid-step, raising a hand for us to stop. I immediately tensed, scanning our surroundings for threats. "What is it?" I whispered after several seconds of silence. Martin pointed to a tree about 20 yards ahead. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just a large cypress with moss draped from its branches. Then I noticed the scratches, vertical marks carved deep into the bark, similar to those I'd seen on the cabin door. "Fresh," Martin murmured. "Made this morning." My hand moved instinctively to the revolver. "The same one from last night?" He shook his head slightly. "Different. The markings are closer together." His expression darkened. "This is bad. They don't usually range so close to each other." "What does it mean?" "Something's driven them into new hunting patterns." His eyes swept the forest. "We need to move. Different route." We backtracked and took a path that led us through denser underbrush, making progress slower but providing better cover. Martin's demeanor had changed, his earlier confidence replaced by a tense vigilance that did nothing for my nerves. The day wore on, the detour adding miles to our journey. My legs burned with fatigue, and Duke was beginning to lag despite his determination. Even Martin showed signs of strain, though he pushed forward relentlessly. "How much further?" I finally asked after what felt like hours of additional hiking. Martin paused, consulting what looked like a homemade map. 2 miles to the main trail, then another mile to the ranger station where you can get help. 3 more miles. It seemed both impossibly far and tantalizingly close. "We'll make it before dark," Martin assured me, correctly reading my concern. "But we can't stop again." We pressed on through the afternoon heat, the forest growing less dense as we approached more traveled areas. Signs of human activity began to appear: an old campfire ring, trail markers on trees, even an occasional piece of litter. Each one raised my spirits slightly. Then Duke stopped abruptly, hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Martin immediately brought his rifle up, scanning the area. I drew the revolver with trembling hands, trying to locate what had triggered Duke's reaction. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. The forest held its breath around us. Then, from nowhere and everywhere, came a whisper. My name, drawn out in a hiss that seemed to circle us. "Elijah." "Don't answer," Martin snapped, though I had no intention of doing so. "Keep moving. Quickly now." We increased our pace to just short of running, Duke limping but keeping up through sheer determination. The whispers continued, sometimes sounding inches from my ear, sometimes distant but always moving with us. "Elijah, we found you in your sleep, tasted your grief. So sweet." My skin crawled, sweat now as much from fear as exertion. Martin led us in a zigzag pattern, occasionally making sharp turns for no apparent reason. "Confuses them," he explained breathlessly during one such maneuver. "They hunt straight lines better." The whispers grew more numerous, overlapping. Multiple voices now, some trying to mimic Melissa, others deeper, older sounding. "Come back to the water, Elijah. She's waiting for you. The dog bleeds well. Let us finish." Duke's growl became continuous, his eyes darting to track threats I couldn't see. Martin's face was grim, his knuckles white around his rifle. "There," he said suddenly, pointing ahead. "See that trail marker? Main path is just beyond. We run now." We broke into a full sprint, abandoning stealth for speed. I scooped Duke into my arms despite his weight, unwilling to leave him vulnerable in his injured state. The whispers rose to angry hisses behind us, branches snapping as unseen pursuers gave chase. We burst through the underbrush onto a wider, clearly marked trail, the main hiking path I'd left days ago. Martin didn't slow, pushing forward with renewed urgency. "Not safe yet," he called over his shoulder. "Keep running until we reach the ranger station." I followed, lungs burning, Duke's weight growing heavier with each step. The whispers had faded somewhat but hadn't disappeared entirely. The trail rounded a bend, and suddenly, miraculously, we saw it. A small wooden building with the Forestry Service logo, a parked ranger vehicle beside it. A thin wisp of smoke rose from its chimney, indicating occupation. Martin slowed to a walk, his breathing ragged. "Made it," he said, relief evident in his voice. I set Duke down gently, my arms trembling with fatigue. He stood shakily but wagged his tail at the sight of civilization ahead. As we approached the station, a ranger stepped outside, a young woman in the standard uniform looking surprised at our bedraggled appearance. "Folks, everything okay?" she called, walking toward us. "Had some trouble on the trail," Martin explained, keeping his answer deliberately vague. "This man's dog is injured. They need a ride back to their vehicle." The ranger's expression shifted to concern. "Of course. Let me take a look at that dog and I'll radio for assistance." As she led us toward the station, I turned to Martin. "You're not coming with us?" He shook his head, gaze already drifting back toward the forest. "My place is here. Someone needs to keep watch, keep them contained." "But after today, they seem to be getting more aggressive, more numerous. It's not safe for you alone." A thin smile crossed his weathered face. "Been unsafe for 30 years. I'm still here." He adjusted his rifle strap. "They took my brother. Won't let them take anyone else if I can help it." I wanted to argue, to convince him to return to civilization, but the determination in his eyes stopped me. This was his purpose, his redemption for being unable to save Raymond all those years ago. "Thank you," I said instead, extending my hand, "for saving our lives." He clasped it briefly, his grip firm. "Take care of that dog. He saved you before I got there." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Elijah? Grief fades. Not quickly, not completely, but it does fade. Don't let it keep you isolated like me." With that, he nodded once to the ranger and walked back toward the trail, disappearing into the forest before I could respond. The ranger looked confused. "Friend of yours?" "Yes," I said simply. "A good friend." Inside the station, the ranger examined Duke's wound, complimenting the quality of the treatment he'd already received. She provided fresh bandages and called for transportation back to my vehicle, which was apparently only about 10 miles away by road. While we waited, I created a sanitized version of our ordeal for the official report: getting lost, Duke being injured by a fall, meeting a helpful local hunter who guided us back. The ranger seemed skeptical of parts but didn't press for details. An hour later, we were in a forestry service truck heading back to my car. Duke dozed beside me, exhausted but safe. I stared out the window at the passing trees, knowing that something ancient and hungry lurked within their depths. Back in New Orleans a day later, our adventure took on an unreal quality. Sitting in my living room with Duke curled at my feet, his side properly treated by a veterinarian, I could almost convince myself it had been some stress-induced hallucination. Almost, but not quite. The lingering ache where that thing had grabbed my ankle in the bayou was too real, as were the nightmares that now visited regularly. I researched the rugaroo legends extensively, finding that many elements matched what we'd encountered, while others seemed like folklore embellishments. I dug into local history, discovering patterns of disappearances in that region of Kisatchie National Forest dating back centuries. 2 weeks after our return, a small package arrived on my doorstep. No return address, no note. Inside was a small leather pouch containing dried herbs, a vial of what looked like salt mixed with iron filings, and a roughly carved wooden amulet. I recognized Martin's handiwork immediately and hung the amulet by my bed that night. The nightmares stopped. I still go hiking, but never alone, never without Duke, and never in the remote parts of Louisiana's forests. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear whispers calling my name, testing whether I've learned my lesson. I never answer. And sometimes I wonder about Martin Thibodeau, still out there in the wilderness, hunting creatures most people will never know exist. I hope he's still fighting, still protecting unwary travelers from the things that whisper in the dark, because they're real, they're hungry, and they know your name.